It was dusk in the Whispering Wood. The aftermath of battle clung to the air like a shroud of mist, and the dying light set the trees aflame in hues of orange and red. The ground was damp underfoot, soaked not just with the muddy leavings of a passing storm, but with the blood and sweat of men who had clashed only hours before. The victory belonged to the North, to Robb Stark's host. Jaime Lannister had been captured, and songs would be sung of the young wolf's cunning for generations, yet the forest was eerily still in that twilight hour, punctuated only by hushed groans of the wounded. Somewhere deeper among the boles of ancient oaks, quiet conversations were taking shape, bound to alter the course of families and realms. Jon Snow had not fought in the Whispering Wood. His path from the wall had been swift, clandestine, fraught with the sense that time pressed upon him like a cold, iron gauntlet. He had slipped away from Castle Black, torn by news of his father's imprisonment in King's Landing. Honor warred with duty in his heart, but he could no longer abide to remain idle on the wall while House Stark, his father's house, teetered on the brink of ruin. He had never expected to arrive in time for the battle that would see Jaime Lannister taken, and yet here he was, the direwolf banners of House Stark flapping over a host of thousand-strong men. He had never dreamed he might stand face-to-face with Robb again, not like this. They met on the edge of the Northmen's encampment, near the flickering light of a single torch set to ward off the night. The quiet swirl of insects, the murmur of soldiers settling down around campfires for what rest they could find after the day's bloody work, these half-drowned all other sensations. Jon stood in the gloom just beyond the perimeter. The torchlight made his fur cloak glimmer faintly, picking out the lines of his face in gold. He had stolen a horse to get here, and the beast was lathered and exhausted. Jon himself felt little better, his bones heavy with travel, grief, and worry. Robb emerged from the darkness. Gone was the boy who once laughed and joked in the snowy courtyards of Winterfell. In his stead stood a man slender in build but firm in bearing, copper-brown hair falling loosely about his face, his eyes filled with the weight of command. He looked at Jon as though confronting a phantom, uncertain whether to reach for a sword or for a friendly embrace. "Jon," Robb said at length, voice tight. Did you desert the Night's Watch?" Jon felt a stab of shame but also conviction. "I did," he said, words short, breath a faint wisp of steam. I heard of Father's capture." He drew in a long breath, the chill night air an anchor to the swirl of emotions inside him. "I couldn't stay." "Not while Father, you risk your life," Robb murmured, stepping closer, any distance now spanned by the closeness of once brothers. "Desertion is death, Jon. You know that." Jon nodded, heart pounding. He could see so much in Robb's eyes, confusion, anger, a spark of hope. "I know, but I had to come." Robb seemed poised to say something else, but no words came. Instead, he pulled Jon into a tight embrace. The tension of the moment slackened as they held each other, remembering for just an instant the warmth of Winterfell's halls, the carefree days when they were only boys playing at swords. It had been only months, but it felt like a lifetime. When they broke apart, Robb's voice was husky with feeling. "We can't talk here. Come." And Jon followed him away from the torchlight, deeper into the woods, away from curious eyes. Soldiers would question the sudden arrival of a Night's Watch recruit, especially one rumored to be Ned Stark's bastard. Ears lurked everywhere in camp. Better to be lost among the looming trunks, where only the whisper of leaves might overhear them. Robb led him to a small clearing where a watchfire had died down to embers, leaving just enough glow to outline the harsh planes of his face. The day's exhaustion lined his eyes, but the mantle of responsibility lay on him more heavily than anything else. He motioned for Jon to sit on a felled log, and Jon did so, mindful of how loud his every move seemed. Even the dryness of broken twigs seemed a thunderous intrusion in that hush. "Tell me everything," Robb said, his voice tight with the demands of leadership. "Have you come to fight for House Stark?" Jon hesitated, swallowing the knot in his throat. There's something else," he murmured, the statement half-choked in the gloom. "I came to tell you something, Robb. Something Father wanted me to know. And by extension, you." He clenched and unclenched his fists as though preparing for an ordeal that made battle seem child's play. "I learned the truth of my birth." Robb's expression tensed further. His eyes flickered to the shadows, as though he expected an attack from the night itself. "Your birth? You speak of yourself as Ned Stark's bastard." Jon shook his head slowly. "I'm not his bastard," he whispered, the admission a trembling weight. "Not truly." Silence fell, broken only by the sound of a distant soldier shouting orders. The flickering glow of the camp offered just enough light to reveal the small details in Robb's countenance. The parted lips, the eyes narrowed in confusion. "What are you saying?" Robb asked hoarsely. "There was a letter," Jon began, the memory making him tremble. He wrapped his hands about himself as though shielding from a cold that went deeper than bone. "Left in a hidden nook in Father's solar. He told me before I left for the wall where I might find it. I thought it would contain his farewell or some words of guidance. But it was so much more." He recalled the day he'd discovered that parchment. It was sealed with Ned Stark's personal sigil hidden behind old tomes about the age of heroes. It had smelled of dust and wax. As he'd unrolled it, his heart hammered, mind alive with possibilities. Yet nothing in his darkest dreams had prepared him for what it contained. "It said," Jon continued, his voice low, "that father was not my father at all. Or rather, he was, but only in name." He sucked in a shaky breath. "He wrote that my mother was Lyanna Stark." Robb blinked. He opened his mouth, closed it, frowned as though grappling with puzzle pieces that refused to fit. "Aunt Lyanna," he said at last. "But how?" "She and Rhaegar Targaryen were." Jon tried to steady himself, but the words threatened to stick in his throat. "They were secretly wed. Their child was me. Father protected me from Robert Baratheon, who would have killed me for my Targaryen blood. Father raised me as his bastard to hide my identity." The crackle of a distant campfire punctuated Jon's confession like an exclamation mark. Robb's face slackened with disbelief, then tensed as the reality began to sink in. "You are the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen?" Robb's voice was soft, as though the statement itself was too dangerous to speak aloud. "And my aunt. That would make you your cousin," Jon said. "But more than that, if Rhaegar truly wed Lyanna, I'm not a bastard at all. I'm the heir to the Iron Throne." The hush that followed felt like an abyss yawning between them. Robb stared at Jon, searching his face for some sign that this was all a trick or a dream from which he could wake. The forest's gentle hush felt oppressive. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed and was answered by another. Men were going about their business, tending to the wounded, seeing to the prisoner Jaime Lannister, all the while oblivious to the seismic secret that shook these two young men in the gloom. Robb set a hand on Jon's shoulder, his grip firm as a smith's vice. "Jon," he said, "if you speak truly, and by the gods, I see no lie in you, this changes everything. Everything. But do you understand what you say? You speak of being the rightful heir. Gods be good, the Targaryens have been dethroned for nearly 2 decades. Have you told anyone else?" Jon shook his head slowly. "No. I wanted to tell you, but I also questioned whether I should keep it secret as Father did. Yet with Father imprisoned and you at war, the Lannisters pressing us on all sides, I thought perhaps the truth might help us. Or doom us. I'm torn." Robb sank down onto the log beside him. For long moments he said nothing, and Jon could practically see him weighing the consequences. As boys, they had rarely kept secrets from each other, sneaking into the kitchens for extra honey cakes, whacking training swords in the courtyard while Robb joked that he would someday be a king and Jon his sworn shield. Now they were older, forced into decisions that might topple kingdoms. At length, Robb exhaled and leaned forward. "All my life," he said softly, "I thought you were my brother. A bastard brother, yes, but still. We were raised together, taught by the same maester, trained by the same master-at-arms. I never once considered you lesser. And now it turns out you might outrank every king in the 7 kingdoms." A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips, tempered by sorrow. "Father did what he believed was right. He always did." Jon's voice was raw. "He wanted me to have a choice," he murmured. "He wrote that he hoped peace might come one day, that I could choose whether to reveal the truth or not. But with him in a Lannister dungeon, there can be no peace. No easy life. If Robert had discovered my lineage, I would have been killed before I could crawl. And now Robert is dead, Joffrey sits the throne, and everything is in chaos." Robb rubbed his brow as though it ached from the weight of 1,000 responsibilities. "We are fighting for Father's freedom," he said. "But also for the North's independence, perhaps, if it comes to that. Some of my bannermen. They speak of crowning me king in the North." He let out a small, mirthless laugh. "Yet, if you are the rightful heir, how does that?" He stopped, the question trailing off into the hush of the forest. Jon lowered his gaze. "I do not know. Part of me doesn't want it, Robb. I was raised a bastard, taught to be humble, to have little claim to anything at all. Now to claim the Iron Throne, it feels like wearing someone else's armor." Robb's expression softened. the intensity in his eyes giving way to understanding. If it were up to me, I would say we do not kneel to Targaryens or Lannisters or anyone else. But, Jon, you're not some distant Targaryen pretender. You're my blood. If you have a claim that could help our cause, even if I do, Jon cut in. How many lords will rally behind the Targaryen name? The realm believes they were mad, that the line ended with Viserys and Daenerys fleeing across the narrow sea. There might be only suspicion for me. I might unify the realm or tear it further apart. Robb rose, pacing in a tight circle around the clearing, boots grinding softly into the forest floor. The torchlight from the nearby camps flickered, revealing glimpses of his face like glimpses of a half-carved statue. Torn was too light a word for his expression. We need to think this through, he said. We must see Father freed, and we must also contend with the possibility of an alliance. If you are truly Rhaegar's sun gods, the great houses will scramble to decide if they stand with or against you. Jon bowed his head, anguish welling up. He had not slept properly in days, and the swirling sense of destiny pressed upon him like an ocean wave. I never wanted power, he whispered. Only a family. At that, Robb stopped pacing and placed a hand on Jon's shoulder once more. You have a family, he said, voice soft, and you always will. We Stark stand together. It was Father's wish to protect you. Now you and I must decide how best to honor his sacrifice. Before Jon could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps in the darkness jarred them both into alertness. Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, slunk out of the shadows, a massive shape that seemed hewn from the very night itself. The beast let out a low growl, but Robb turned, saw a figure holding a lantern, Theon Greyjoy. The Ironborn stepped into the clearing, annoyance etched on his lean face. There you are, Theon said, voice low but urgent. I've been looking everywhere for you, Robb. The men, they wonder if you're well. And he trailed off as his lantern light fell upon Jon's face. His eyes widened in incredulity. Jon Snow? What in the seven hells? Jon rose to his feet, tension coiling in his limbs. He knew Theon as a comrade of sorts, though more often a teasing presence that found amusement in Jon's bastardy. Theon, Jon acknowledged quietly, an uneasy tilt to his voice. Robb cleared his throat, stepping between them. Jon has come from the wall, he said simply, as though that explained everything. The half-truth hovered in the cool air. We need a moment, Theon. Tell the men I'll be back soon. Theon frowned, but he gave Robb a curt nod. Jon could see questions swirling in those pale eyes, questions that were best left unsaid, at least for now. Theon said, sounding unconvinced. But don't be long. Roose Bolton returned from his pursuit of Tywin's outriders, and he wants a word. Something about how we should treat the Kingslayer. With a last lingering glance at Jon, Theon turned and walked away, lantern bobbing like a star in the blackness. When Theon was gone, Robb exhaled sharply. We won't have much time, he said to Jon. My bannermen will want counsel. I must decide what to do with Jaime Lannister. There are many decisions to be made. But first, he paused, wrestling with the enormity of it all. First, if you speak the truth, then I must know every detail. I must know what Father wrote, what your plans are. For my part, I will keep your secret until we decide otherwise. Jon nodded. A subtle relief seeped into him. He had carried the weight of this alone for so long, and now, in sharing it with Robb, he felt less of the crushing burden. Thank you, he said, voice low. I'll tell you all I know. They sank down on the felled log once more, close as they'd been in childhood. The tension of the forest pressed upon them, but for a time they spoke in hushed murmurs about Rhaegar Targaryen, about Lyanna Stark, about the Tower of Joy. Jon recounted as best he could the stories Ned's parchment contained, the heartbreak and the duty, the love and the horror that had shaped the rebellion. All the while, Robb listened, eyes shadowed with wonder and dread. And as the darkness deepened, so did their bond. Bastard and heir, wolf and dragon, they shared a secret that could topple any throne. Yet in the quiet of those trees, they were still Robb and Jon, two boys from Winterfell, uncertain what the morrow would bring but resolved to meet it together. The Northmen's victory in the Whispering Wood had won them Jaime Lannister, but it had not won them peace. The war ground on, and the night gave way to a morning thick with tension. Camp stirred as outriders reported Tywin Lannister's movements. Ravens flitted in and out with messages from the south. The battered men tried to recover, patching armor, seeing to wounded horses. Even victory had a price, and the respite promised by the green hush of the forest seemed fleeting. Jon Snow found no true rest that night. He was offered a bedroll near Robb's tent, an offer that, in quieter times, might have warmed him. But his mind was too full of swirling thoughts and guilty fears. He had abandoned his vows to the Night's Watch, even if for noble reasons. He had discovered that everything he once believed about himself was a lie, and he now stood on the precipice of a war he hardly understood. Sleep came in snatches, broken by half-remembered images of Winterfell, of Ned's stern but loving face, of ghostly Targaryen banners fluttering above a city in flames. Dawn broke, the sky bruised with mauve and pink as though the very heavens bore the wounds of war. Jon roused himself and found that Robb had already left to attend a meeting of his bannermen, presumably to decide the immediate fate of Jaime Lannister. With no pressing direction, Jon took a moment to wander the camp, hood drawn over his dark hair, as inconspicuous as possible. Yet even in anonymity he felt eyes upon him, soldiers noticing a stranger among them, wondering who he was and why he merited a place near Robb's tent. He tried not to engage. The risk was too high, the truth too explosive. But as he passed by the row of picketed horses, a voice called his name softly, and he turned to find Great Jon Umber staring at him. "Jon Snow?" Great Jon rumbled, bushy eyebrows knitting together in surprise. "Seven hells, boy, what are you doing here? I thought you'd have black brothers around you, not wolves." Jon struggled for a polite answer, well aware that half the camp watched. "I received leave to bring news," he managed, voice low. "Lord Robb allowed me to stay for a time." Great Jon snorted, unconvinced. "The Night's Watch doesn't hand out leaves like sweets. But I suppose there are bigger matters at hand." He hesitated, then leaned in, voice dropping lower. "If you're any help to Robb, well, we can use all the help we can get. But watch yourself. War can be a messy business for a lone wolf." Jon just nodded and moved on. His chest felt tight as a drawn bowstring. He was not used to lying, and Ned Stark's teachings rang in his head. Truth was the foundation of honor. Yet his entire life had been built on a lie. A bitter irony. He pushed onward, trying to keep to the edges of camp, listening to the distant buzz of men. They spoke of the Kingslayer's capture, of Tywin's next move, of how the Riverlords might respond, of what to do if the phrase proved fickle. Rumors and speculation swirled like leaves in a storm. No one seemed certain of anything. Eventually, Jon found himself near a small circle of wounded men. Maesters and healers moved among them, offering what comfort they could. He recalled that once, in Winterfell, he had tended to an injured stable boy, and how he'd been gentle and patient, mindful of each moan and whimper. Now, seeing these men, he felt a surge of empathy for the cost war exacted. He was no stranger to blood, having fought whites beyond the wall. But these were living men, loyal to Robb, battered and broken. It reminded him that war was not just talk of banners and alliances, but flesh and bone. He knelt beside one soldier, a boy hardly older than Bran, his face pale, an arrow wound in his shoulder. The lad's teeth were clenched in pain, eyes shut. Jon offered a bit of water, pressing the skin gently to the boy's lips. After a few sips, the boy looked at him blearily. "Thank you," he whispered. Jon nodded, heart heavy. "Where are you from?" "White Harbor," the boy managed. "My father's a dock worker." He winced with a spasm of pain. "Said I was strong, good with a bow. Wanted me to see the world or at least earn a place in Lord Stark's forces." Jon swallowed thickly. Winterfell was a lifetime away. "Rest?" he murmured, not knowing what else to say. "The Maester will be along soon." He moved on, not wanting to linger and draw attention. But the boy's haunted eyes followed him as he left. War devoured the young, the innocent. Jon's chest constricted with the knowledge that all this might have been avoided, if only kings and princes had made different choices. When he came upon Robb's tent, he found the place bristling with activity. The tent flaps were open, letting the crisp morning air waft in. Great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton, and others of the northern lords filed out, faces set. The meeting had apparently concluded, though from their expressions, it was not with full agreement. Jon ducked out of sight. behind a barrel until they dispersed, not wanting to cross them too soon. Finally, Robb emerged. He looked drawn, like a bowstring stretched to its limit. Gray wind padded by his side, the great dire wolf sniffing the air warily. Jon stepped forward, and Robb's gaze flickered with relief on seeing him. "Come inside," Robb said quietly, motioning Jon into the tent. Inside, the space was dominated by a large table scattered with maps, miniature carved wolf heads marking their own forces, painted lions representing the Lannisters, trout for the Tullis. The strategic artistry of war. On a side table lay a plate of bread and cheese, largely untouched. A single brazier lent warmth to the chilly morning air, but the tension that clung to the space made it colder than any winter wind. "I've told the bannermen that you are here on behalf of the Night's Watch," Robb said in hushed tones. "They question it, but I said that you carry vital information about the wall and that we needed to confer privately." He let out a strained sigh, rubbing at the back of his neck. "We must decide how to proceed with Jaime. Some want his head on a spike. Others think we might trade him for father or for Sansa and Arya. The great Jon wants vengeance, says Lannister blood demands more Lannister blood. Bolton, well, you never quite know what Bolton wants. I'm trying to heed their counsel, but the final decision is mine." Jon nodded, uneasy. "Are you leaning toward a trade?" he asked, thinking of Ned's life. More than anything, Jon wanted Ned freed. The notion of his father, and yes, Ned was still his father in every way that mattered, rotting in a Lannister cell, ate at him. "That's my thought," Robb said quietly. "But the men are howling for retribution. And if we simply release Jaime, the Lannisters might see that as weakness. There's also the question of whether the Lannisters would honor any agreement." He gritted his teeth. "We're at war. Trust is a currency in short supply." Jon exhaled. "What can I do? This secret of mine. Does it help or complicate things?" Robb's eyes hardened with resolution. "For now, we keep it between us. That is what Father wanted, I'm sure. He never told anyone else. Not even Cat, I suspect. If you declared yourself Targaryen, it might spark chaos in our ranks. Some lords would refuse to fight for a Targaryen. Others might be drawn by the promise of a new monarchy. We'd tear ourselves in two. We need the North united if we're to stand against the Lannisters." Jon tried to breathe through the tension in his chest. The truth was a heavy burden, but he had known that from the start. "Then I'll keep silent," he said. "What do you need from me?" Robb studied him for a moment. "Perhaps you can talk sense into some of my men. Remind them that we must be strategic. I trust your counsel, Jon. You understand men's hearts, even if you claim not to." A faint, wry smile touched Jon's lips. "You speak as though we're still in Winterfell, you learning the ways of command. Me, your loyal sparring partner." For a moment, a flicker of warmth crossed Robb's features. "Perhaps we are," he said softly. "But these are real swords now." Jon nodded. "I'll do what I can." They spoke a while longer, sharing insights, discussing plans. Robb confided that he meant to ride west soon, seeking to draw Tywin out or secure a stronger position. His mother, Catelyn Stark, had gone to meet with Renly Baratheon and attempt some alliance. Each piece on the board was in motion, and no single move promised victory. War demanded cunning, courage, and a ruthless edge that Jon knew was at odds with Robb's kind heart. But the young wolf would do what needed doing for the sake of his family, for the North. As they concluded, Robb rose, pacing to the tent's opening. "I must see Jaime personally," he said, "and I'd have you come with me. I want him to see that he's not the only sword at my back." A subtle grin flickered. "We Starks must stand together." Jon swallowed, heart hammering with old resentments. Jaime Lannister had tried to kill Bran, or at least so everyone believed. Bran's fall from the tower, the sightless look in his eyes as he lay in that bed, unresponsive. The memory stung. Even his anger kindled in Jon's chest. He said, "I'll stand with you." They left the tent, joined by a small guard of Northmen, a pair of stout Karstark men and another from Deepwood Motte. As they crossed the camp, Jon could feel more stares turning in his direction. Whispers might be speculating. Why does Robb Stark trust this black brother so closely? But none dared voice their suspicions aloud. The Northmen parted in front of them, acknowledging Robb's authority with salutes or respectful nods. They found Jaime Lannister bound in a makeshift cage of iron bars, under heavy guard. He sat on the ground, hands in shackles, his once glistening golden hair now matted with dirt and dried blood. His pride, however, remained as bright as ever. He lifted his chin as Robb approached, and even in captivity, his smirk held a sting. "Ah," Jaime drawled, voice echoing faintly within the cage. "The boy who would be Wolf King, come to gloat over your prize." Robb's face was unreadable. "I've come to offer you water," he said, gesturing for one of the guards to pass a skin into the cage. Jaime took it with a sneer but drank deeply, as though half-parched. "We'll see to it that you don't die from thirst," Robb added. "Better to keep you alive until we decide your fate." Jaime wiped his mouth, tossing the skin aside. "Until your mother returns, no doubt. She'll counsel you to exchange me for your precious father. A pity that even if you tried, Joffrey is as likely to send you Ned Stark's head as honor your trade." Robb tensed, but he did not rise to the bait. "We'll see," he said evenly. "Until then, mind your tongue. It's the only thing you have left." Jaime's gaze flickered to Jon, eyes narrowing with recognition. "Ah, the bastard, is it? Or shall I call you the Black Crow? I hear deserters lose their heads too." Jon clenched his jaw but said nothing. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in his gut. If Jaime suspected the truth of Jon's parentage, there was no sign of it, only mocking. Even so, every muscle in Jon's body ached to lash out, to demand answers for Bran's fall. But that was not his place, not with Robb in command. Robb stepped closer to the cage, dropping his voice so only Jaime could hear. "You will remain under watch," he said. "I advise you to keep your scorn to yourself, and pray that my father remains alive." With that, Robb turned on his heel, and Jon followed, the guards parting. Jaime's mocking laughter followed them, a brittle sound that grated against Jon's nerves. They walked back through the camp in tense silence, until at last they reached a calmer spot near the picketed horses. Jon exhaled, a shudder passing through him. Did he do it? Push Bran. Robb stared at the ground. "We only have suspicion. But yes, I believe he did. And the Queen too. They fear the truth. Bran said he couldn't remember what he saw that day in the tower, but I suspect it was something that threatened them." Fury trembled through Jon, but he reined it in. War demanded control. "We must be sure, though," he managed. "If he did, he's guilty of more than just capturing father. He tried to murder my brother." Robb didn't correct him for calling Bran his brother. They shared a look, each understanding the other's pain. "I know," Robb said, voice tight, "but let's keep our wits. Jaime is a cunning foe, even in chains." Jon nodded, pushing away his anger. "Of course." And so the day wore on, long and fraught with concerns. Messages arrived from the Freys, from the Tullus, from the Vale. Robb's command was tested by the restless lords, each with their own opinions. Jon lingered on the sidelines, offering quiet counsel, trying not to reveal too much. The weight of the secret between him and Robb pressed on him like a physical thing, but neither of them spoke of it again that day, for there was no privacy in the swirling chaos of camp. Night fell once more, and the forest seemed to murmur with secrets as the cold wind whispered through the leaves. The men huddled by fires, jesting nervously about the next day, about the Lannisters. Some boasted of how they'd cut Tywin to pieces, others prayed for a quick end to the war. Jon found a quiet corner away from the fires, leaning against a tree, Ghost at his side. The albino dire wolf had found him earlier, padding silently through the camp, a phantom of white fur and red eyes. Jon stroked the wolf's head, feeling the familiar sense of kinship, though it felt overshadowed by the swirling vortex of his life. "What are we to do?" he murmured, as though Ghost might answer. "Robb has an army. I have a secret. Could it truly change anything?" Ghost's ears twitched. He stared into the darkness, body tense, as though sensing an unseen threat. Jon sighed and closed his eyes, letting the night enfold him. A rustle of leaves brought him alert. He turned to see Robb approaching quietly, gray wind beside him. The two dire wolves exchanged glances, each acknowledging the other in that primal language of beasts. Robb sank onto a low rock, letting out a weary sigh. "They wonder," Robb said, his voice soft and private in the hush of the night. "The men. They keep asking why you're here, or how I know I can trust you. I've told them you're my brother. In spirit if not in name." He glanced at Jon, face weary. "Does it bother you?" Jon shrugged, though he felt the pang of it. "No. I've always been called your brother. Nothing new." A thin, sad smile crossed Robb's face. "But you aren't," he said. "You're my cousin. A Targaryen, or half a Targaryen. It's still strange to think. I look at you and I see a Stark. My father's blood." But there's another father in your veins too. Jon let out a slow breath. I feel like a Stark, he admitted. That's all I've known. Lyanna was a Stark, and Ned raised me as his son. Even if I have Targaryen blood, I don't feel it. He looked up at the sky where a waxing moon glowed faintly through drifting clouds. I don't know if I ever will. Robb studied him in the flickering starlight. No matter the truth, he said, voice low, you will always be of Winterfell. I swear that to you. The sincerity in his tone made Jon's throat constrict. He extended a hand and grasped Robb's forearm. Thank you, he whispered. That means more than you know. For a moment, silence wrapped them like a cloak. The night was still, the hush of the whispering would living up to its name. Then Robb's expression hardened with determination. Tomorrow, we march west. If Tywin aims to relieve his son, he'll have to go through us. I want you by my side, Jon. Not in the vanguard, but close enough that men see you as my trusted companion. Whatever I decide about Jaime trade or no trade, I need my bannermen to see that the Starks stand united. Jon squared his shoulders. Then I'll ride with you. I'll do whatever needs doing. But, Robb, he added, a tremor in his voice, what if we lose? Tywin is no fool. The Lannisters are rich, cunning. We have numbers, but war is uncertain. Robb's jaw set. We stand or fall together, he said. For father, for our family, for the North. No matter what the bards sing of the Targaryens. Our father gave you life under the Stark name. I'll not see that undone by a Lannister blade. He stood up, gray wind shifting at his side. Get some rest. We ride at dawn. Jon nodded and Robb departed, merging into the shadows. Ghost settled, head on Jon's knee, and Jon stroked the wolf's ears in silence. The prospect of battle loomed. He had faced horrors beyond the wall, but war among men felt a different beast. Men schemed, lied, betrayed, all for power. If his blood gave him any claim to that power, he hardly wanted it. Yet destiny was as relentless as winter. It would come regardless of his wishes. All he could do was stand firm with the only family he had ever known. So he remained, Ghost's quiet companionship his sole solace as the embers of campfires glowed in the blackness. The night drifted on and dawn drew ever closer. They marched as the sun peaked over the horizon, the Northmen a silent tide of steel and fur. Banners snapped in the chill wind, gray dire wolves on white fields, the occasional black bear for House Mormont, the sunburst of Karstark, the flayed man of Bolton. Jon rode near Robb, flanked by Theon and a grim-faced Roose Bolton. Grey Wind loped alongside, ever watchful. The day wore on in a steady plod of hoofs. The roads here were rough, hemmed by dense forests. Scouts rode ahead, returning with word of no immediate Lannister presence, but tensions remained high. Whispers circulated that Tywin might try an ambush or that he had retreated to Harrenhal. No one truly knew. War was a tapestry of rumor. Jon rode in uneasy silence. Theon cast him occasional curious glances. Roose Bolton, pale as a ghost, said little but carried an unsettling aura. Robb remained composed, resolute in his bearing. Whenever he caught Jon's eye, he offered a faint nod as if to say, you belong here. They camped that evening along a winding river, the air damp with the promise of rain. Robb called his lords to council again, poring over maps in a hastily erected pavilion. Jon stood near the back, half listening to the heated debates. Great Jon argued for pressing further west, for capturing Lannisport if possible, or at least sacking it to break Lannister morale. Bolton suggested a more conservative approach, waiting to see if Tywin would come to them. The arguments filled the air with tension. At length, Robb raised a hand for silence. We cannot simply march on Lannisport, he said. It's too far and we leave ourselves exposed. We must move quickly, unpredictably. Tywin cannot be allowed to unify his forces with the remnants of Ser Gregor's band. What of the Kingslayer? Asked Lord Rickard Karstark, face twisted with hatred. My sons died fighting his ambush. I'd see him pay. A rumble of support coursed through the gathered men. They wanted Jaime's head. Jon tensed, feeling the precariousness of it all. Robb's gaze swept the pavilion. We will not execute Jaime Lannister, he said, voice firm. Protests erupted immediately, but Robb's eyes blazed with commanding authority. We hold him. His life may yet buy us our fathers. If we kill him, we gain nothing but revenge. He paused, letting the lords see his resolve. We are not butchers. That quieted them, though resentment lingered. Jon saw the men exchange looks, their anger simmering. Theon rolled his eyes but said nothing. Bolton remained silent, his pale eyes giving nothing away. After the meeting disbanded, Jon approached Robb. That was brave, he said under his breath. They wanted blood. Robb nodded grimly. I know, but I can't yield to that. Father always taught us that justice must serve a purpose, not vengeance. He rubbed his temples. And I must keep you close, Jon. I need a trusted counsel who isn't beholden to the squabbles of the great houses. Jon offered a half-smile. Me? I'm hardly a lord or counselor. Robb's expression softened. You're a Stark. My father's son in every way that matters. That's enough. Words of gratitude died in Jon's throat as Theon strolled up, his grin lopsided. So, Theon said, addressing Jon, you've become Robb's new advisor, have you? You always were thick as thieves. Jon bristled, carefully masking his irritation. Theon had a knack for prodding insecurities. I'm just here to offer what help I can, he said evenly. Theon shrugged, turning to Robb. We have outriders to the north. Word is Lannister horse might be nearby. I'll help lead a scouting party, see what's out there. Robb nodded. Do it. Take a dozen men. Be wary, Tywin is known for cunning ambushes. Theon smirked, a flash of arrogance in his eyes. I'm cunning too. He clapped Robb on the shoulder, shot Jon a final quizzical look, then strode off into the deepening dusk. Robb let out a slow breath. I don't fully trust him, he confided in Jon. But we need him. He's been raised in Winterfell, but the Iron Islands could side with the highest bidder. Still, father took him as a ward to keep Balon Greyjoy in line. Now I must keep him in line. Jon dipped his head. We'll watch him. Robb nodded, then motioned Jon to follow him away from the pavilion. They walked along the river's edge, water reflecting the streaks of pink and orange in the sky. Have you heard any news from the wall? Robb asked, breaking the silence. Jon's gut twisted at the mention of the place he had abandoned. Nothing. I fear what they might do when they learn of my desertion. Perhaps they'll send rangers after me. He rubbed a hand across his brow. I acted without thinking. But I'd do it again. Robb was quiet for a long moment. If we can rescue father, perhaps he can arrange something with the Night's Watch. Keep them from hunting you down. Father has friends there, older men he served with. They might show mercy. Jon's heart twinged with hope. And if the Lannisters kill him first? Robb's jaw tightened. They will not. They stood there in the hush, the sky darkening overhead. For a fleeting moment, Jon wished they were back in Winterfell, two young men training in the yard, daydreaming of glory. War had stripped away those illusions. Still, they held fast to each other. The next day dawned with a chill wind and dark clouds gathering in the west. Scouts returned with conflicting reports. Some had spotted columns of Lannister men far to the south, others to the northeast. The unpredictability weighed on everyone. The Northmen continued their march west, though caution slowed their pace. Hours bled into hours, the men's nerves stretched taut. Around midday, Jon rode beside Robb at the head of the column. Rain drizzled down, turning the path into slick mud. Their banners drooped, sodden. Conversation died to a weary shuffle of hooves and the slosh of wagon wheels. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Abruptly, an outrider galloped toward them, horse flanks heaving. The man's face was pale. My lord, he gasped at Robb, there's a Lannister force ahead, perhaps 2,000 strong, camped near a ridge by the river crossing. They've taken up a defensive position. Robb stiffened, eyes narrowing. 2,000? Fewer than us, but enough to pose a threat. Do they know we're here? The outrider shook his head. Don't think so, not yet. The terrain is rolling hills and a thick stand of oaks. We might approach unseen if we circle wide. Robb glanced at his bannermen who'd ridden forward on hearing the news. Greyjoy, Karstark, Bolton, they all waited for his command. The tension crackled. Jon felt his pulse quicken. Another battle loomed, and these were no petty skirmishers. This was a Lannister force, well-armed and disciplined. We'll attack, Robb said at last, voice firm. We cannot afford to let them regroup or scout us. If we strike now, we might catch them off guard. The lords nodded, though Karstark's lips twitched. A bold move, my lord. Robb spurred his horse around. Great, Jon, lead the left flank. Lord Bolton, the right? I'll take the center. Jon, you ride with me. He hesitated, then gestured to a messenger. Summon the men to arms. Quietly. We'll approach under cover of these hills. Within minutes, the army stirred like a slumbering beast roused to fury. Men donned helmets, strapped on shields, checked bowstrings. Horses snorted in the damp air. Robb gave swift instructions, dividing his force to encircle the rid. From 3 directions. Theon was nowhere to be seen, still out scouting, perhaps. The hush of preparedness settled, the calm before a storm of steel. Jon's heart hammered as he rode behind Robb, near the center. The path wound through a cluster of low hills crowned with stunted trees. Beyond lay the Lannister camp, or so the outrider had said. Grey wind loped silently at Robb's side, ghost mirroring him at Jon's. The men advanced slowly, each hoofbeat seeming like a drumbeat in Jon's ears. And then the terrain opened up, revealing a shallow valley. Beyond, perched on a gentle rise by the river, stood the Lannister encampment, a sprawl of tents and pavilions in gold and crimson. The lion banners flapped sullenly in the rain. Their perimeter was lightly guarded, the footmen clumped around fires, unaware of the northern host creeping toward them. Robb raised his hand, halting his line. Jon watched with breath caught in his throat. The plan was simple. Grey Jon and Bolton's men would strike the flanks, sow confusion, and Robb's center would crash down like a hammer. A standard tactic, but if it was timed well, it could shatter the Lannisters' line. Thunder growled again, closer this time. Jon scanned the horizon, straining to spot any sign that the other flanks had moved into position. The gray drizzle blurred his vision, made the world soggy and muted. The men breathed in taut silence, nerves jangling. Suddenly, a horn blast cut through the mist, deep and resonant, from the left flank. Greyjon's men had begun their charge, men pouring over a low ridge with a roar. The horns echoed from the right flank as Bolton's contingent crashed into the Lannister pickets. The camp erupted in shouts and clamor. Lannister soldiers scrambled, their lines disordered, some still without armor, roused from midday rest. Robb lowered his sword in silent command, and the center charged. Horses thundered forward, men shouting, spears and swords raised. Jon's adrenaline surged. He spurred his mount, Ghost racing alongside, a white streak. Rain pelted Jon's face, the taste of iron in the air. He tightened his grip on Long Claw, the Valyrian steel Ned had entrusted to him. They swept down into the Lannister camp like a torrent of steel. The young wolf's host slammed into disorganized footmen who barely raised pikes in time. Jon's sword found a Lannister soldier's shield, splintering it aside. Another soldier lunged at him with a short sword, but Jon parried, feeling the jolt up his arm, then drove Long Claw through the man's cuirass. A flash of horror gripped him. This was no practice yard, but he pushed it aside, forced to fight for his life. Chaos reigned. Shouts and clangs filled the air. Men slipped in the mud, horses reared, steel clashed. Robb's warhorse trampled a Lannister man-at-arms, gray wind bounding ahead to tear at a fleeing soldier. Jon grit his teeth, pressed onward, fighting side by side with Northmen he barely knew. His sword arm ached as he parried blow after blow. At the camp's heart, a cluster of knights formed a ragged shield wall, rallying under a lion banner. Jon glimpsed the flash of gilded armor. Ser Adam Marbrand, perhaps, or another Lannister stalwart. Robb saw it too, urging his men forward. They crashed into the shield wall, roars echoing. Jon's horse slipped and fell, sending him tumbling into the mud. His heart jolted, but he scrambled up, Ghost snarling at his side. A knight lunged at him with a heavy mace. Jon rolled aside, sinking to his knee, then slashed upward. The Valyrian steel cut through the knight's thigh plate, toppling him with a cry. Breath ragged, Jon found Robb amid the confusion. Robb's face was smeared with mud, his hair plastered to his forehead. Their eyes met, each acknowledging the other, then they turned to continue the fight. The fury of battle roared in Jon's ears, drowning out all else. Gradually, the Lannisters yielded ground. The North's flanking maneuver had cut off escape routes. Men threw down weapons, kneeling in the churned muck. Others tried to flee toward the river but were cut down by Karstark horsemen. The carnage was brutal, horrifying. Jon's chest burned. He had survived, but at what cost? When the fighting finally ebbed, the drizzle still fell, washing blood and grime into rivulets of red-brown water. Robb strode through the ruined camp, giving commands, ensuring that the wounded were tended, prisoners secured. Jon followed, limbs shaking with fatigue. Ghost padded silently, muzzle stained with blood. "Jon," Robb said softly, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "Are you hurt?" Jon shook his head, though every muscle throbbed. "Not badly." Robb nodded, relief etched across his features. "We won," he murmured. "They're scattered or captured. We must gather our dead, see to the wounded." His gaze flicked to a knot of prisoners corralled by a ring of spears. "Then we'll decide what to do with them." Jon glanced around at the devastation. Overturned tents, corpses sprawled in the mud, wounded men groaning. The stench of blood mixed with the acrid smell of wet ashes. Ghost let out a low growl. Jon reached to calm him, heart aching at the sight of so much death. A sudden cry broke the moment. Jon turned to see a Lannister archer, half hidden behind a collapsed tent, fumbling with a knocked arrow. He had a clear shot at Robb, who stood in the open, unawares. Time slowed. Jon dashed forward, screaming Robb's name, just as the archer let fly. Jon threw himself into the arrow's path. It whistled by his shoulder, grazing him and plunging into the wet earth. In that heartbeat, Robb spun around, eyes wide with alarm, and a Northman slammed into the archer from behind, silencing him with a spear thrust. Panting, Jon felt blood trickling from a shallow cut. Robb rushed over. "Gods!" he exclaimed. "Are you?" "I'm fine," Jon managed, wincing as the sting spread. The arrow had missed anything vital. Just a scratch. Robb's relief was palpable. He clapped a hand on Jon's shoulder, heedless of the blood. "You saved my life," he said, voice trembling with emotion. Jon shook his head, breath ragged. "Just did what anyone would." Robb's eyes flashed. "I'm not sure anyone else would have leapt in front of an arrow." He swallowed. "I owe you, cousin." The word cousin seemed jarringly out of place in this bloody scene, yet it carried a bond deeper than titles. Jon tried to form a response, but words eluded him. He settled for a nod. The tension between them was that of two men who had walked through the jaws of death, bound together by loyalty and fate. Together, they surveyed the aftermath, ensuring no further threats lurked. By evening, the rain had intensified, soaking through every layer, making the battlefield a quagmire. The Northmen huddled in what remained of the Lannister tents. Fires sputtered in the downpour, and men cursed their fortune, though they took grim satisfaction in victory. Later, after a swift dressing of Jon's wound by a maester, he and Robb sat by a small brazier, steam rising from their soaked cloaks. Robb's face was drawn, exhaustion lining his eyes. "Another victory," he said wearily, "but we lost good men." Jon nodded, hearing the distant groans of the wounded. "The cost was always too high. We need to end this war," he said softly, almost to himself. "If we can ransom Father with Jaime and these prisoners, if we can find a way." Robb poked at the brazier coals, a frown settling on his brow. "I hope so," he murmured. "I truly do." In the flickering light, they caught each other's gaze, a silent pact passing between them. Jon might be a Targaryen by blood, but he was a Stark at heart, and he would fight for the family he loved. Robb was the young wolf, burdened with the crown he had not yet taken but was nearly forced to accept. Yet for this moment, they were simply two battered souls leaning on each other's strength. Rain drummed on the sagging canvas above them. The night pressed in. War raged on beyond the edges of the world they knew, devouring lives. But they had each other, and with that, some semblance of hope. The war did not end the next day, nor the day after. Tywin Lannister was not so easily crushed, and the clash of lions and wolves continued. Yet something had changed in the Whispering Wood and on that rain-soaked battlefield. Robb Stark's victories gained him a legend. The young wolf, cunning and fierce. Word spread through the armies and the small folk alike. And Jon Snow, the bastard who fought beside him, became a quiet figure of respect among the ranks. Whispers circulated that he had the wolf's trust like no other. No one suspected the deeper secret, the truth that Jon was not Ned Stark's bastard, but the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Only Robb carried that knowledge, and the burden weighed heavily on them both. Occasionally, in the privacy of tents or under the hush of night, they would speak of it in hushed tones. Robb would wonder if, upon rescuing Ned, the truth might come out, if it could help end the war. Jon would shake his head, uncertain. The realm was not ready, perhaps never would be. Houses had sworn vengeance against House Targaryen. The name conjured images of dragonfire and madness. Despite the tension, the bond between them grew stronger each day. Soldiers noticed their ease in conversation, the way they fought side by side, saved each other in the skirmishes. None dared question it openly, for fear of angering the young wolf. If anything, their unity was lauded as proof that House Stark stood firm, bastard or not. Weeks passed, each day a new test of survival, strategy, and alliances. They advanced deeper into the Riverlands, forging alliances with the Tully Bannermen, seeking to preserve the region from the Lannisters' ravages. Jon marveled at the vastness of the realm. He had never traveled so far south before. The nights were not quite as cold, the flora unfamiliar. Yet the stench of war lingered. Villages burned, peasants fled. The Lannisters had left scars on this land. At Riverrun, they were greeted with cautious relief by the Tullys, who praised Robb for capturing Jaime. Catelyn Stark returned from her negotiations in the south, hurrying to embrace her son. She cast a wary eye on Jon, but under the circumstances, she made no open complaint of his presence. She was too grateful that he had risked his life for Robb. The tension between Jon and Lady Catelyn remained, unspoken but palpable. She had never taken kindly to Ned's bastard, but war forced uneasy compromises. They learned that Eddard Stark had been forced by Joffrey to confess treason in the Great September of Baelor, only to be executed. But in this altered course of events, spurred by the threat of Jaime's captivity, Cersei had intervened to prevent the beheading. Instead, Ned remained imprisoned, a living bargaining chip. The news sent waves of relief and renewed fear through the Starks. Ned was alive, but for how long? Each day that passed threatened Joffrey's whim. Death might come at a moment's notice. Still, that slender thread of hope kept Robb's resolve unbreakable. "We have a chance," he told Jon quietly in Riverrun's Great Hall. "If we can break Tywin's army, if we can force the Lannisters to the table, we can demand Father's release. Him and our sisters." Jon nodded, though dread coiled in his chest. He clung to the possibility that Ned would be saved, that the man who had protected him all his life would survive this madness. The realm needed Ned Stark's honor more than ever. More personally, Jon needed the man he had always called father, Targaryen blood be damned. But the war was not done. No matter how skillfully Robb maneuvered, Tywin's forces regrouped, supplemented by new levies from the west. Battles flared across the Riverlands, each side trading victories and losses. The season wore on, the leaves turning from green to gold, the roads growing slick with autumn rains. There were nights the northern host slept under cold stars, uncertain if the next day would bring a Lannister ambush. In those nights, Jon sometimes dreamt of Winterfell, a place of warmth and safety that seemed a distant memory. Other times, he dreamt of dragons, great wings beating a stormy sky, flames licking the clouds. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the legacy of Rhaegar Targaryen stirring in his blood. Ghost would be there, eyes gleaming in the darkness, a silent sentinel. Jon would reach out a hand, burying his fingers in the wolf's fur to ground himself. One night, he dreamed of a great crypt beneath Winterfell, where the statues of the ancient kings in the north stared at him as if in accusation. He whispered, "I am your blood." But the statues said nothing. When he told Robb of it the next day, they both felt uneasy, as though the old kings judged them for the path they trod. Yet duty pressed on. They had to fight, to negotiate, to risk everything. And so it was that the final confrontation with Tywin Lannister's main host came upon them abruptly on a fog-bound morning by the Red Fork of the Trident. Robb had gleaned from scouts that Tywin meant to force a crossing, aiming to smash the Stark-Tully alliance. Both sides massed for a pitched battle. Trumpets and horns echoed through the mist, the clang of armor haunting. Jon stood with Robb at the center, gray wind prowling restlessly, ghost-like in the swirling fog. The lines collided in a thunderous rush. Spearmen braced, cavalry thundered, arrows whistled. Jon found himself in the thick of it, sword singing as he blocked a mace, lunged at a dismounted knight. The air was a cacophony of screams and steel, the world narrowed to the haze of battle. More than once, Jon narrowly evaded death, a Lannister halberd snagged on his cloak, a crossbow bolt striking a shield behind him. Through it all, he glimpsed Robb in the swirl of chaos, the young wolf rallying his men, gray wind ripping through the lines with savage ferocity. The day wore on in a frenzy of violence. Both armies bled. Jon's limbs screamed with fatigue, but he pressed on, spurred by the memory of Ned, by the promise he made to stand with Robb. When at last the Lannisters began to buckle, Tywin himself led a desperate charge to turn the tide. It was then Jon caught sight of the infamous Lord Lannister, clad in ornate lion-emblazoned armor, commanding with ruthless efficiency. But the Starks and Tullis held fast. The Greyjoy's booming war cry pierced the din, Karstark men cutting down swathes of Lannister foot. One by one, the lion banners toppled in the mud. Tywin, seeing defeat, withdrew his cavalry in an organized retreat, ceding the field to the wolves. When the horns sounded the victory, Jon stood panting, splattered with mud and gore, Longclaw's edge stained red. Robb's men roared in triumph, though the price lay in bodies strewn across the field. Another victory, but still no end. Tywin had not been captured, only forced to withdraw. Blood churned the river's shallows, a horrific testament to the cost. In the aftermath, as the Northmen tended their wounded, Robb found Jon near the banks of the Red Fork. He was limping slightly, a cut on his arm, but he wore a triumphant mien. Gray wind at his side, muzzle streaked with blood. "Tywin's gone," Robb said, grim satisfaction in his voice. "Retreated west. We hold the river." Jon nodded heavily. "Will he sue for peace?" Robb cast a glance toward the fallen men. "Eventually, perhaps. If we push him further, I'll call another war council. The ravens must be sent to King's Landing. We have Jaime, we have beaten Tywin in open battle more than once. They must realize they can't break us easily. Maybe now they'll negotiate for father." Jon's chest constricted. Pray they do. Under the gray sky, they locked eyes, each carrying a quiet determination. The war was not finished, but they had won a chance. And that chance might mean saving Ned Stark's life, preserving the North from Lannister dominion. It was in the Great Hall of Riverrun, weeks later, that the herald from King's Landing arrived. A slender man in gold and crimson livery, face pinched with arrogance, but overshadowed by the fact that he carried a sealed letter bearing the royal seal. The entire hall fell silent as Robb and his lords assembled. Jon stood at Robb's left, quiet but present. Catelyn Stark stood on Robb's right, her gaze keen and full of guarded hope. The herald read the letter in a bored tone. King Joffrey offered a truce, Ned Stark's release and safe passage for Sansa and Arya in exchange for Jaime Lannister and a cessation of hostilities. As the words hung in the air, murmurs rippled through the gathered lords. Many scowled, suspecting a trap. Others glanced at each other with cautious optimism. Could it be so simple? Robb's face remained unreadable. "A truce," he repeated quietly. "To last how long? And under what conditions?" The herald sniffed. "The terms are clearly stated in his grace's letter. Lord Eddard Stark will be returned to you, as well as his daughters. In return, the Kingslayer will be freed immediately, and you will withdraw your forces from the Riverlands, returning to the north, swearing no further rebellion against the Iron Throne." Catelyn's eyes burned with the desire to accept. She wanted her husband safe, her daughters back in her arms. Jon could see her trembling with the force of her restraint. Robb, however, stood stoic, mind-churning. He glanced at Jon, then at his mother. "Leave us," Robb said to the herald. "We will give you our answer in the morning." The herald opened his mouth to protest, but a pointed glare from Great Jon silenced him. With a stiff bow, the man departed, escorted by guards to guest quarters. The lords in the hall clustered around Robb, voices rising in debate. Some pressed to accept, seeing Ned's freedom as paramount. Others warned that Joffrey could not be trusted. Theon was particularly vocal in calling the offer a trick. Karstark insisted Jaime should lose his head. Catelyn said nothing in the clamor, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. Robb's face betrayed no emotion as he listened, letting the lords vent their fears and anger. Then he raised his hand, and the hall quieted. "Mother Jon," he said, "walk with me." They left the hall together, ignoring the calls of the lords demanding to know his decision. Robb led them to a private solar near the top of Riverrun's tower, a narrow room with tall windows overlooking the river. The hush inside felt profound after the shouting below. Robb paced, gray wind sitting by the door. "We can't simply reject the offer," he began, voice raw. "It may be the only chance to save father. But if we accept, we must trust that Joffrey will keep his word. And that is a heavy gamble." Catelyn's voice trembled. "Ned's life hangs in the balance, Robb. Our girls. How can we risk them?" Robb exhaled, turning to face her. "I know. That's why we must consider carefully. Joffrey has proven himself cruel, but perhaps the council in King's Landing pushes him to offer this truce. Tywin wants Jaime back. Cersei might see reason. If we can secure strong enough terms, maybe we can guarantee father's life." Catelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Your father's life, my husband, if there's any chance." Her voice broke. "Gods, Robb, I want him back." Robb embraced her, stroking her hair. Jon stood aside, heart heavy. He wondered if he should speak, if his secret might sway the balance. Would Joffrey respect the rightful heir more than an upstart rebellion? Likely not. Yet the possibility churned within him. When Catelyn composed herself, she looked at Jon with eyes that bore both sorrow and a flicker of apology. "You have always loved Ned as a father," she said softly. "And you risked your life for Robb. Will you speak, Jon? What do you think we should do?" Jon swallowed, feeling the weight of her question. He remembered Ned's kindness, the gentle ruffle of his hair, the stern lectures on honor. A father in every sense but blood. "I think," he began carefully, "we should ensure the conditions are enforceable. If we give Jaime away too quickly, we lose our leverage. The Lannisters might kill Ned the moment Jaime is free. We need a simultaneous exchange or something that binds them to their word." Robb nodded. "Yes, we do. But can we arrange it? Joffrey won't want the war to continue if we have Jaime. Tywin's pride will not want to appear weak." Catelyn looked at them both. "Perhaps we can propose neutral ground. The twins, or Moat Cailin, or somewhere else not under direct Lannister control. We exchange Jaime for Ned and the girls at the same time, in the presence of witnesses who matter, lords who would not dare let the Lannisters break faith." Robb frowned thoughtfully. "Walder Frey is hardly trustworthy, but Moat Cailin might be an option. Though it lies in the north. The Lannisters would balk at stepping foot there. We must find a place that suits both sides." Jon felt a surge of urgency. "Whatever we decide, we must do it quickly. Every day we delay is a day Ned is at Joffrey's mercy." Catelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Yes." Robb let out a shaky breath. "I'll gather the bannermen again, propose we counter the Lannisters' terms with our own. We'll demand a safe exchange. If they refuse, we keep Jaime and continue the war. If they accept, then perhaps father comes home. One way or another, we must be ready." Catelyn bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you, my son." Robb pulled her into another embrace. Jon averted his gaze, giving them privacy. His heart beat a frantic rhythm. The chance that Ned might live fueled him with desperate hope. Yet he sensed the precariousness of it all. One misstep, one act of bad faith, and the heads would roll. What of his secret? He had come to confess it, to share it with Robb, hoping it might somehow help. But so far, no opportunity had presented itself where the truth of his birth would ensure Ned's safety. If anything, revealing that the Starks had sheltered a Targaryen heir could ignite greater conflict. For now, it remained locked within the circle of trust he and Robb shared. They parted ways. Robb summoned his lords to council again. Catelyn retreated to pray in the Sept, seeking the gods' mercy. Jon made his way to the ramparts of Riverrun, standing above the rushing waters, letting the wind buffet him. He stared at the horizon, where storm clouds gathered again. The realm was like those clouds, roiling with uncertainty. He closed his eyes, remembering the final lines of Ned's secret letter, the words that still echoed in his mind. "You are the hope for a future, Jon, a union of ice and fire. Do not let the shadows of the past rule your destiny. Live, choose." The time for choices was drawing near. They hammered out a formal reply to Joffrey's truce proposal. Robb demanded a simultaneous exchange at Harrenhal, neutral ground recently seized by Roose Bolton in the name of the king in the north. For indeed, some lords had already crowned Robb Stark as king in the north, though he had not yet donned a crown nor taken the title publicly. The Lannisters would bring Ned and the girls under safe conduct, the Northmen would bring Jaime. Both sides would sign guest right, witnessed by key lords of the Trident and the Riverlands, ensuring that any treachery would see the perpetrators named oathbreakers and damned. The herald departed, letter in hand, while the northern host began preparations for the journey to Harrenhal. Tensions ran high as some men argued that handing Jaime back was madness, but Robb insisted that freeing Ned Stark was worth the price. "We cannot let him die," he declared, "and my sisters too." Rumors flew that Tywin might refuse, that Joffrey might scorn the demand for neutrality. Yet after an agonizing wait, ravens arrived, the Lannisters agreed, albeit grudgingly. There would be a parley, an exchange, under the watchful eyes of lords who could not be easily swayed. Jon's heart thrummed with cautious excitement. They were close, closer than ever to saving Ned. If the exchange went as planned, House Stark might be reunited. Perhaps then, Jon could decide whether or not to reveal himself, to share his burden with Ned. Would Ned want the truth out in the open? Or had he expected Jon to keep it hidden forever? The journey to Harrenhal took days. The fortress itself loomed like a nightmare on the horizon, massive and half-ruined, haunted by the ghosts of Harren the Black. Storm clouds brooded over its melted towers, the setting sun casting eerie shadows across scorched stone. Bolton's men held it now, turning those enormous halls into a makeshift stronghold. The moat stank of brackish water, and the drawbridge creaked ominously as the northern host crossed. Inside, torches lit the vast courtyard, revealing row upon row of tents. The main keep soared overhead, a jagged testament to Dragonfire's power centuries past. Jon felt a shiver of awe at the sight. Here, Aegon Targaryen had once unleashed Balerion the Black Dread, turning Harrenhal's towers to molten ruin. Now, ironically, a Targaryen stood among the Starks, unknowing eyes gazing at the remnants of his ancestors' conquest. The appointed day arrived. The Lannisters came, accompanied by a retinue of the King's Guard, including the Hound and others loyal to Joffrey. Catelyn Stark, Robb, and their bannermen waited in the great hall under Harrenhal's twisted vaults. Jaime was brought forth in chains, though groomed and clothed to fit the gravity of the occasion. Jon stood close to Robb, heart-pounding. If the Lannisters tried any treachery, he would not hesitate to defend Ned, no matter the cost. A hush fell as the Lannister party entered. Cersei was not present, but the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Ser Barristan Selmy, recently reinstated, it seemed, and Littlefinger, along with a dozen armed men in the red and gold of House Lannister. Between them, shackled but alive, walked Ned Stark. His hair was streaked with gray, his face gaunt, but his eyes blazed with resolve. Behind him, Sansa and Arya were led, alive and unhurt if somewhat thin. Catelyn gave a cry, rushing forward. Ned saw her, tears in his own eyes. The moment burned into Jon's memory. Father and mother reunited, battered by war but still standing. Then Ned's gaze flicked over her shoulder, and he saw Robb. Pride and relief suffused his features, and beyond Robb stood Jon. Their eyes locked, a moment of profound recognition. Jon nearly lost his composure. This man had risked everything to protect him, to shield him from Robert's wrath, to raise him as a son when he was never truly so. Now Ned was the one who needed rescuing. The tides of fate were cruel indeed. Littlefinger cleared his throat, stepping forward with a polished smile. "Shall we proceed with the formalities?" he said silkily. Robb's voice rang loud in the hall. "Release my father and sisters now. We have Jaime here. We can do this cleanly, without bloodshed." The tension was palpable. Jaime stepped forward, flanked by guards. Ser Barristan held out a key to Ned's shackles. Slowly, ceremoniously, they unbound him. Catelyn hovered close, as though fearing a last-minute betrayal. Sansa and Arya's chains fell away too, and Arya bolted into her mother's embrace, tears streaming down her face. Ned limped, leaning heavily on Ser Barristan, but he straightened as he faced Robb. "My son," he said quietly, "you've grown." Robb clasped Ned's arm gently, tears in his eyes. "We had to free you, father. That's all that matters." Ned's gaze shifted to Jaime, standing stiffly, arms bound. "You have him prisoner?" Robb nodded. "He's our bargaining chip. But now we hand him back. For you, Sansa, Arya." Ned's eyes flickered with conflict. "I see. May the gods forgive us if this is a mistake." But the relief in his voice was clear. The exchange proceeded. Jaime was unshackled, handed over to the Kingsguard. Ser Barristan took custody of him, face grim, though it was clear that the Lannister knights were eager to spirit Jaime away. The hush in the hall was tinged with hostility. Northmen glared at the Lannisters, Lannisters glared back. Yet no one dared break the agreement, not under the watch of so many neutral lords. Harrenhal's ominous presence weighed on them all, a reminder that once, a king had broken faith and was met with Dragonfire. Once the formalities ended, the Lannisters escorted Jaime from the hall, departing swiftly. Tension ebbed, replaced by a stunned sort of joy and disbelief among the Starks. Sansa wept openly, clinging to Ned's arm. Arya's grin broke through her tears. Catelyn held them both, murmuring soothing words. Robb stood by Ned's side, supporting him, speaking quietly of the war. And Jon lingered at the edges, a swirl of emotion in his chest. He wanted to fling his arms around Ned, to cry out how relieved he was. But he was not sure if that was his place. At last, Ned looked past Robb and fixed his gaze on Jon. Catelyn and the girls gave way, allowing Ned to approach. The father and the boy who was not his son stood face to face. Jon trembled, uncertain what to say, remembering the last time they had spoken, by the steps of the great keep in Winterfell. Ned had told him, "The next time we see each other, we'll talk about your mother." That time had never come. Until now. Ned's voice was quiet, laden with meaning. "Jon," he said, a question and a greeting in one. Jon bowed his head, a flood of emotion overwhelming him. "Father," he whispered, tears threatening. Are you well?" Ned lifted a hand, cupping Jon's cheek with a gentleness that belied his injuries. "I am now." His gaze roved Jon's face as though memorizing it anew. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, "We have much to discuss." Jon's throat closed, tears burning behind his eyes. He nodded. "Yes," he managed. "We do." And so, in the haunted halls of Harrenhal, with war still raging outside these walls, Ned Stark lived, reunited with his family. Jon Snow found himself on the verge of revealing a truth that could reshape the Seven Kingdoms. But for this moment, they breathed the same air, father and son. Perhaps not by blood, but by a bond forged in love and honor. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For winter was coming, and secrets long kept would not remain hidden forever. Ned Stark stood there in Harrenhal's great hall, gaunt and stiff from his imprisonment but alive, with Sansa and Arya clinging to him and Catelyn hovering close. Their tears of relief flowed freely, heartbreak mingling with the uncertain joy of reunion. Torches flickered along the walls, the twisted stone arches overhead a silent witness to this tenuous peace. War still raged beyond those walls. The smell of smoke and damp mortar clung to the gloom, and yet, for a moment, the Starks breathed together again, a family reunited. Robb Stark bowed his head to his father, fighting back his own tears. Pride warred with sorrow in his eyes. He had striven so hard to achieve this moment, to keep Jaime Lannister captive, to outmaneuver Tywin, to force the Lannisters to bargain. The cost in northern lives had been steep, and now that Ned stood before him, Robb felt the sheer weight of command crushing his shoulders. Once, he had been simply Ned Stark's heir, with the comfort of his father's guidance. Now he was the young wolf, a commander and a king in the eyes of many. He yearned to yield that burden if Ned might take it back. But things were never so simple. Catelyn offered Sansa a hand and gently guided her and Arya back a step, letting Ned stand on his own feet in the watery light. Ned's gaze passed over each of them, and then it lingered at last on Jon Snow. For a long moment, neither father nor son spoke. Jon's heart pounded in his chest, a confusion of relief, guilt, and abiding love for the man who had raised him. "Jon," Ned murmured at last, voice hoarse, "I am glad to see you safe." Jon dipped his head. "And I you," he replied, voice tight with emotion. He wanted nothing more than to embrace Ned, to let himself be a child again, but time and war had hardened them both. Jon was no longer that uncertain boy in Winterfell. He stood tall, sword at his side, the weight of secret knowledge pressing on him. Even so, he lowered his eyes in a gesture of respect. "You've been in my prayers, father." A flicker of pain crossed Ned's face at the word father, as though it was both a comfort and a burden. He offered a small nod, but he said nothing more on that count, not here in this hall of echoes and too many listening ears. Then he turned to Robb, exhaling softly. "My son, how do we stand?" Robb clasped Ned's arm gently. "We hold the Riverlands with the Tullus. We have lost men, but we have beaten Tywin's host on 2 fields, and we forced him to retreat west. We held Jaime as a prisoner, and that was how we were able to bargain for you, for Sansa and Arya." A hint of regret slid into his tone. "But we've returned Jaime to them now." Ned's eyes flicked toward the doors through which the Kingslayer had been led, back into Lannister custody. "A high price," he murmured, "but one I cannot regret." He let his gaze move to Arya, who stood hugging Catelyn's waist, her hair tangled, face smudged with dust and tears. "You did well, my boy. You protected our family when I could not." Robb's throat worked, tears threatening. He embraced his father gently, mindful of the bruises and half-healed injuries beneath Ned's ragged clothing. Then he eased back, composing himself. "We must find time to speak," Robb said quietly. "Away from prying ears. There is much to tell." Arya piped up, her voice small but fierce. "I want to stay with father. I want to hear everything too." Ned mustered a faint smile. "We'll all have time to talk, little one. But first I need rest, and I suspect the maester will wish to see me. I have cuts and aches from King's Landing's hospitality." Caitlin touched Ned's arm, heartbreak and joy struggling on her face. "Come," she said softly. "We'll find you a proper bed, and I'll not leave your side." Sansa clung to her mother and father both, too overwhelmed to speak. Robb gestured, and a pair of guards led the way out of the hall, deeper into the winding corridors that Harrenhal offered. The huge fortress, so ruined in places yet still massive, could house thousands, though it remained a grim place. Ghostly drafts slipped down corridors. The melted towers loomed overhead like twisted talons. But it was a roof, a seat of power in the Riverlands, forcibly taken by the North's men after Ser Amory Lorch and Gregor Clegane's marauders had retreated. Now it belonged, at least for a time, to the wolves. Jon lingered behind as the family. His family, though not truly by blood, moved out. He exchanged a glance with Robb, whose eyes still shone with emotion. Then Robb nodded once, silently conveying that they should follow. Jon fell into step behind them, and thus the group ascended spiraling staircases into the half-intact portion of Harrenhal's keep, accompanied by a retinue of loyal guards. They reached a suite that had once been a Lord Solar. The windows gaped, black and open to the night, offering a view of Harrenhal's courtyard with its flickering torches. The floors were covered in rushes that crackled underfoot. The walls hung with threadbare tapestries depicting scenes long lost to the ages. There, Ned settled onto a bench near the fireplace, grimacing with the effort. Robb sent for Maester Vyman, who had traveled from Riverrun at Caitlyn's request, to check on Ned's wounds. Sansa and Arya hovered, each wanting to speak but seeming unsure how. Arya eventually rushed to Ned's side and sat on the floor by his knees, ignoring the dust on her skirts. Sansa took a seat nearby, posture rigid with a ladle-like air that cracked around the edges whenever she looked at her father's face. Caitlyn stood watch, the lines of fear and relief etched into her expression. Meanwhile, Jon and Robb positioned themselves near the broad windows, letting the family have their moment. Jon could feel every breath, aware that his presence might cause tension. Caitlyn had never truly welcomed him as her own. Yet now, with Ned returned, perhaps some old wounds would mend, or perhaps new ones would open. Maester Vyman arrived, a modest, soft-spoken man with a neat, graying beard. He bowed to Ned, then gently examined him, pressing fingers to bruises, checking the half-healed lash marks on Ned's back. He murmured about poultices and rest. Ned endured it in silence, except for a hiss of pain now and then. All the while, the tension in the room grew taut with unasked questions. Finally, when Vyman finished, Ned bowed his head to the maester and thanked him. Then he waved at the extra guards. "Leave us," he commanded. "I must speak privately with my family." The guards shot glances at Robb, who nodded approval, and they stepped out, shutting the heavy wooden door. Only the Starks and Jon Snow remained, plus the maester, who made to leave as well, but Ned gestured for him to stay. "We may need your counsel before this night is done," he said wearily. Caitlyn frowned, suspecting some hidden matter, but said nothing. Robb approached the table, resting his palms on its ancient surface. Jon hovered behind, uncertain. At last, Ned broke the silence. "I must know all that transpired in my absence," he said, voice low. "I hear talk that the Northern Lords proclaimed Robb as king in the North. Is that true?" A flicker of conflict rose in Robb's expression. He straightened. "After news of your imprisonment," he said quietly, "some lords insisted that the North would never again bow to a Southern king. They crowned me in their camp, though I never donned a crown. It was a gesture of defiance, father, but one that holds weight with them. They call me the young wolf, believing I am chosen by the old gods to lead the North's armies." A faint, weary smile crossed Ned's face. They were always a stubborn people, he said. We Starks included. And what of this war? We have fought battles, but to what end? Robb's features tightened. To rescue you, he answered. To keep the Lannisters from subjugating the north. Tywin marched west eventually, but it cost many lives on both sides. I had no choice. I had to secure our position. Ned nodded, though regret lined his eyes. I see. And the girls, he glanced at Sansa and Arya, who listened with round, worried eyes. How were they treated in King's Landing? Sansa swallowed, voice trembling. The Queen wanted me to write letters to you, to Mother, begging you to confess treason so that you might have a trial. She said it was for your own good, that you would be spared. Tears welled in her eyes. I believed her. But Joffrey, he's cruel, father. He never intended to release you. Only if we gave them Jaime back, which we did in the end. He wanted your head anyway. The Queen had to stop him from giving the order. She shook as she remembered, and Ned's face clouded with anger. Arya blurted, they kept me locked in a room most of the time. The Hound once caught me sneaking out. He laughed and said I'd best not cause trouble. I hate him. I hate the Lannisters. Her fists balled up, a flush of anger across her cheeks. I want my sword back. Ned let out a slow breath. One day, he said softly, you'll have it. He looked around at them all, his expression calm but laced with a deep sorrow. We are together again. That is what matters most. Now we must decide the course ahead. Catelyn's voice wavered. Can we not go home? Return to Winterfell? Haven't we done enough? We have you back and the girls. Must we continue to fight? Robb answered before Ned could. If we retreat, we leave the Riverlands open to more Lannister raids. We have sworn to protect Mother's kin, the Tullis. The Great Jon, Karstark, Bolton. All of them will not be content to slink back north. They want victory, or they want independence from the Iron Throne. The men have bled for it. Ned closed his eyes. I will not abandon the River Lords who sheltered our cause, he said. Nor can I simply bend the knee to Joffrey, who calls himself king. We have come too far. He glanced at Catelyn with regret. I wish we could just return to Winterfell and let the realm do as it will. But the Lannisters would never let us remain in peace. No, we must see this through to a conclusion. One that keeps our people safe. Catelyn nodded, tears in her eyes, but she did not protest further. Ned sighed and shifted his gaze to Jon, at last allowing the weight of that stare to linger. Jon, he said, I have heard whispers that you left the Night's Watch to join Robb. The tone was gentle, but the undercurrent of concern was plain. What happened at the Wall that you would take such a risk? Jon swallowed, feeling everyone's eyes on him. He sensed the tension from Catelyn, from Sansa, from Arya, although Arya offered him a shy smile, for she had often been the one sister who seemed less hostile about his bastardy. I deserted, Jon said quietly, bracing himself for Ned's disapproval. When I learned you were taken, that the King, Robert, had died and you were imprisoned, I couldn't stay. I couldn't do nothing. I know the penalty. I came anyway. A flicker of pain crossed Ned's face. They punish deserters with death. By law, he stopped, voice thick with conflicting feelings. Gods. Jon, you must have known you risked your life. Jon lowered his head. Better my life than let them kill you without me lifting a finger to help. Robb placed a reassuring hand on Jon's shoulder. He saved my life in battle, father. Fought at my side. The men see him as a loyal comrade, vow or no vow. Ned bowed his head. He has always been loyal. I know that well. He reached out a trembling hand. Jon hesitated, then stepped forward, allowing Ned's hand to settle on his forearm. You have my thanks, Jon. And my concern. We must see if we can repair this breach with the Night's Watch, but that is a worry for another day. In the quiet that followed, Ned's gaze flicked to Robb, then back to Jon, a subtle question forming on his lips, one that Jon saw stirring behind his father's eyes. But Ned said nothing further about it now. Likely, he sensed that this was not the place to address Jon's parentage. A discreet knock at the door startled them all. The Greyjohn's booming voice came through, My lord, we must speak of the next move. The lords are gathered in the hall. Robb exhaled and looked to Ned. Father. Ned nodded slowly, pain evident in his movement as he rose. I'll speak with them. He glanced at Catelyn, Sansa, and Arya. Stay. Rest. We'll talk again soon. Then he turned to Maester Vyman. But do see to it that my family has a guard posted. We're not so foolish as to assume the Lannisters won't betray us if they see an opening." Robb offered Ned an arm, and together they left the room. Jon followed in their wake. He sensed Ned's exhaustion with every step, but the Lord of Winterfell refused to bend beneath it. They descended the winding stairs, passing under the gloom of Harrenhal's high ceilings until they emerged in the same great hall where the exchange had taken place. The northern lords and a scattering of river lords were already gathered, voices echoing off the cavernous walls. When they saw Ned Stark enter, a hush spread through them. Robb guided Ned to the head of the gathering. Great Jon Umber, with his wild beard and bullish shoulders, sank to one knee, a gesture that prompted others to follow. Lord Rickard Karstark, the men of House Glover, Mormont, Bolton, Mallister, Blackwood, each performed a bow, acknowledging Ned's authority. For although they had named Robb king in the north, Eddard Stark was still the patriarch of House Stark, the man whose name carried enormous respect among northern folk. He had led them to victory against the Ironborn years ago, and his sense of honor was legend. Ned surveyed them all, clearly taken aback by the wave of devotion. The great Jon rose, eyes glistening with emotion. "Lord Stark," he said, "we are blessed to have you returned. We have followed your son these many months, but your presence heartens us all. Will you lead us now? Or does the young wolf remain our king?" A nervous ripple passed among the assembled men. Roose Bolton watched with calm detachment, pale eyes like chips of ice, while the Tully lords studied Ned carefully. Robb tensed beside his father, uncertain how Ned might respond. Ned cleared his throat, steadying himself. "I am Eddard Stark," he said, voice resonating with quiet power. "Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, though Joffrey has likely stripped me of that title in King's Landing. You have followed my son. Many have crowned him king in the North. I do not seek to diminish his authority or your loyalty to him, but I stand ready to advise and fight for the safety of our lands." He inclined his head to Robb. "Robb, my son, do you still claim the title you were given? Or shall we name you simply the Lord of Winterfell and carry on as we did before?" Robb hesitated, glancing at the lords who had so fervently proclaimed him. Great Jon spoke up before he could answer, pounding a fist to his chest. "We named Robb our king, and we'll not lightly set that aside," he rumbled. "But we named him thus to free you, as well as to free ourselves from southern tyranny. Now that you stand among us again, Lord Stark, we want your counsel. If it pleases you both to share command, we'll follow." A murmur of agreement coursed through the men. Ned looked at Robb, lines of weariness etched deep in his face. "I cannot call you a usurper of my rightful place. You acted from necessity. If the men wish you to remain their king, so be it. I will stand by you so long as we serve the same cause, the defense of the North and all our people." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But you must all realize the war is not finished. Joffrey sits the Iron Throne, and Tywin Lannister is still formidable. We must decide what we fight for. Is it independence, or is it justice, or is it the security of our families?" The great Jon made a rough gesture. "All of it, I say. We want the Lannisters to pay for their crimes. We want freedom to rule ourselves. We want no southern kings to meddle in our affairs, and we want the safety of our wives and children. Are we not strong enough to demand it all?" Roose Bolton's voice slipped in, smooth and controlled. "Strength alone doesn't guarantee the Lannisters will yield. Tywin is wily, and the boy on the throne is cruel. Our negotiations might be short-lived. If we press them, they may respond with more war or alliances with other great houses." He paused, eyes flicking between Ned and Robb. "We must consider forging alliances of our own. Stannis Baratheon claims the throne by right. Some say Joffrey is no true Baratheon. And Renly Baratheon also calls himself king. They circle like wolves around a wounded stag." A hush followed. Indeed, in the ravens and rumor that had drifted north, they had heard of Stannis and Renly both claiming the Iron Throne. Civil war brewed across the realm. The men shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to ally with one of the Baratheons or stand entirely apart. Ned took a measured breath. "We have not yet declared for any Baratheon. We have enough trouble defending the Riverlands and our own borders. But we must plan carefully. If Stannis truly is the rightful heir by law, then we might find common cause with him against the Lannisters. But if Renly's forces overshadow Stannis, we risk backing a claim that might fail. These are precarious choices." Lord Karstark nodded vigorously. "We'll do as you and Robb advise. I lost 2 sons to the King Lair. I want vengeance, my lord, but I'll not see the North drowned in southern blood if there's no gain." All eyes turned to Ned and Robb, who exchanged glances. Robb's voice came, steady but quiet. "We must gather more information. We need to know what's happening with Stannis at Dragonstone, with Renly in the south, with the Tyrells of Highgarden, with Mace Tyrell's ambitions. We cannot fight every battle alone. Perhaps we can treat with Stannis or Renly for mutual support. We want the Lannisters driven back, we want our father to remain free and not threatened again, and if the realm ends up fracturing, we must ensure the North stands strong through that storm." Ned gave his son a brief nod, approval flickering in his gaze. Then he turned to the lords. "For now, see to the wounded. Fortify Harrenhal's defenses. This fortress is cursed, but it's a strategic stronghold all the same. Send riders to Riverrun, to the Twins, to Moat Cailin, making sure our lines of supply remain secure. Also, I want ravens dispatched to the Eyrie for my sister's assistance, and to White Harbor that they might send fresh men and ships. Winterfell must remain garrisoned. We cannot leave the north empty." He paused, scanning the men. "And let me rest this night. On the morrow, I will speak in detail with each of you and we will decide how to proceed." Dismissed. The men bowed or saluted, then filed out, their footsteps echoing in the vast hall. Ned stood trembling, fatigue plain on his face. Robb offered him an arm, but Ned shook his head. "I can stand," he murmured. "Just tired." Jon hovered nearby, anxious. Ned finally turned to him. "Walk with me, Jon," he said, voice low. "Robb, I'll return to my chamber shortly. I need a moment alone with your brother." Robb inclined his head, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "As you wish, father." So the two of them, Ned and Jon, made their way out of the great hall through a side door leading to a dark corridor. The air there was cold and smelled of damp stone. Torches flickered in intervals along the walls, casting dancing shadows. They walked in silence until they reached a small alcove near a shuttered window, away from passing soldiers. Ned's steps were unsteady, and he leaned against the wall, breathing laboriously. Jon moved to support him, but Ned brushed away the help with a gentle shake of his head. "I'll be all right," he whispered, as though any louder speech might crumble the composure he'd held all day. "Just a moment." Jon stood guard, half expecting someone to intrude, but the corridor remained still. At length, Ned drew himself upright and fixed Jon with a gaze that seemed at once proud and sorrowful. "You found the letter," Ned said quietly, a statement more than a question. Jon's heart kicked up in his chest. So Ned knew that he knew. He struggled to form words. "Yes," he managed at last, voice rough. "I found it where you told me it would be. I read your words. About my mother. About who I am." Ned closed his eyes, and for a moment, lines of regret and relief etched deeper into his face. "I prayed you would not have to face it so soon, but this war forced our hand. You have told Robb." Jon nodded. "He knows. I told him soon after I returned from the wall." Ned pressed his lips together. "Any others?" "No," Jon said. "We decided it was too dangerous. If the realm knew I was Rhaegar's son, they would see me as a threat, or a means to claim the throne. I don't want that, father." He almost choked on the word father, knowing it was not strictly true, but it was the only name that felt right in his mouth. Ned's eyes softened. "Nor did I. That was why I hid you. Risked Robert's wrath by letting him believe you my bastard. Lyanna made me promise on her deathbed to protect you. She asked me to keep you safe from Robert and from the realm's hatred of Targaryens. I would do it all again." Tears pricked Jon's eyes. "I'm sorry you had to bear that burden," he whispered. "You must have endured whispers and scorn from—" He did not say Caitlyn's name, but they both knew it was implied. Ned shook his head. "It was worth it to keep you alive. You are of Lyanna's blood, and yes, of Rhaegar's, but you have been raised a Stark in all but name. I hope you remember that you are my son in every sense that matters." Jon swallowed hard, a knot tightening in his throat. "I do," he said. "I always will." They stood in silence, the corridor's torchlight casting Ned's face in flickering gold. Finally, Ned spoke again, voice hushed. "Jon, what do you mean to do now? The knowledge of your birth is dangerous. If any Lannister discovered it, or if the Baratheons or Tyrells learned of it, you might become a target. Some might seek to kill you to keep you from a throne that's never truly been yours. Others might thrust you forward as a figurehead, stirring a new war. And we have enough war already." Jon clenched his jaw. "I won't claim the Iron Throne. I have no interest in it. I'd sooner live in the north or return to the wall, though I can't, not after deserting. Bitterness welled in him. I only want to stand by my family and keep them safe. Ned's shoulders sagged with relief. That is all I ever wanted for you, he said softly. We will keep this secret, then. Until or unless there is a dire need for it. Robb knows. We must trust his discretion. If the day ever comes when revealing your parentage might save lives, we'll face that choice together. Tears glimmered in Jon's eyes. He forced a nod. All right, he whispered. Ned touched Jon's shoulder. For a moment, father and son simply stood, hearts too full for more words. Then Ned swayed, exhaustion threatening to topple him, and Jon caught him, guiding him gently back toward the main corridor. We should get you to your chamber, Jon said, voice trembling. Ned nodded, leaning on Jon's support this time. Yes. I suspect Maester Vyman would scold me for being on my feet so long. His eyes flicked toward Jon, an attempt at a wry smile. Thank you, my boy. Jon's chest tightened with emotion, and he looked away to hide the tears that threatened again. Together, they made their slow way back to the room where Caitlin waited. The corridors felt colder now, or perhaps Jon simply felt the weight of his secret more heavily than ever. Yet something else warmed him from within, the knowledge that Ned Stark truly loved him, that no matter the Targaryen blood in his veins, he would always be a Stark as well. 2 days later, Ned's strength had somewhat improved, and Harrenhal buzzed with activity. Raven after Raven departed, carrying letters to every corner of Westeros as the Starks sought alliances and gleaned information. The courtyards rang with the clamor of blacksmiths forging new blades, the grunt of soldiers drilling. The fortress's gloom did little to deter the sense of momentum building. Plans for the next move in the war took shape. Caitlin had set Sansa and Arya in chambers near Ned's, insisting they remain close. Arya, restless as ever, slipped away at times to practice with a wooden sword she'd acquired from some soldier's kit. Sansa stayed near her mother, still fragile from her time at court. The threat of being dragged back to King's Landing haunted her, though Ned promised that would never happen again. Robb spent hours in council with Ned, Bolton, and other lords, shaping their strategy. Jon found himself engaged in tasks that underscored the awkwardness of his position. He was no lord, and some men still called him the bastard of Winterfell with half a sneer. Yet Robb insisted Jon be included in certain councils, especially those about troop movements. Jon's skill in battle had earned grudging respect, and he found that many men listened when he spoke of cunning approaches or vantage points on the field. He saw Theon Greyjoy watch him with narrowed eyes, as though jealous of the trust Robb placed in Jon. But Theon said little, busy flirting with serving girls or sharpening his dagger with an air of bored confidence. Late one evening, Jon stood in Harrenhal's highest accessible tower, gazing out at the swirling mists across the ruined courtyard. Ghost pressed against his side, the direwolf's red eyes scanning the darkness. Jon inhaled the cool air, letting the flicker of distant torchlight dance in his vision. He had always found a measure of solace in quiet nights, away from the noise of men. Here, in this haunted stronghold, the quiet seemed amplified by the ghosts rumored to walk these halls. A faint scuff of boots behind him broke his reverie. He turned to see Robb approaching, a cloak wrapped around his shoulders to ward off the chill. Grey Wind followed at his heels, tail high. The two direwolves acknowledged each other with the faintest growl, then settled. You're up late, Robb said softly, stepping beside Jon at the parapet. He peered into the night. Hard to believe we hold Harrenhal, once the seat of Harren the Black, melted by Aegon's dragons. Now it's ours, at least for the moment. Jon's mind flashed to the legacy of the Targaryens. Yes, he said, voice controlled. Strange how things come full circle. Robb angled him a sidelong look, perhaps guessing the direction of Jon's thoughts. But he made no comment. Instead, he propped his elbows on the crumbling stone. Father is recovering, he said. He was reading over the missives from the Vale from your Aunt Lisa. She's reluctant to commit the Knights of the Vale to any conflict. Stannis's messages are cryptic. He demands we acknowledge him as the rightful king, or face the wrath of the Iron Throne. Jon snorted softly. It sounds like we'll have no easy allies. None, Robb agreed. But Father says we might open a dialogue with Stannis, see if we can come to terms. If we help him unseat the Lannisters, perhaps he'll let the North stand apart. Or at least rule the North with autonomy. But that might cost us. And then there's Renly with the Tyrells behind him. Word is they've proclaimed him king in Highgarden, though the details are scarce. He might field the largest host in Westeros if the Tyrells fully commit. They fell silent, the swirl of the night wind tugging at their cloaks. Ghost let out a low growl, but quieted when Jon touched his neck. Gray Wind stood alert, as though sensing some distant threat. After a time, Robb spoke again carefully. "How fare you? With father returned, I know you must have relief, but also conflict." Jon kept his gaze on the distant lights, thinking of the conversation he'd shared with Ned, of the vow he'd made to keep his parentage hidden. "I'm at peace knowing he's safe," he said. "He remains my father, no matter what blood might say." Robb studied him, half his face touched by torchlight. "He has said as much to me," he replied gently, "that you are his son in truth if not in name. He told me that I was right to trust you with the knowledge. He trusts you still." Emotion pricked at Jon's eyes. "Your father, our father, is a good man. Yes, and we have him back." Robb paused, glancing aside. "So, Jon, do you mean to remain at my side? Or do you wish to return north, if you can? The Night's Watch might be swayed by father's word. He could arrange a pardon, perhaps. You wouldn't be forced to remain a deserter." Jon considered that possibility, though it left him feeling whole. "Lo, I gave my life to the Watch once," he said slowly. "I believed in its purpose, in protecting the realm against what lies beyond the wall. I still do, but I can't see myself returning now. Too much has changed, and the war is not done. I can't walk away from it, not when the Starks need every blade." Robb nodded, perhaps relieved. "I'm glad. I need men I trust, who aren't swayed by politics or personal ambition. As soon as we have a plan, we'll move. Whether it's forging an alliance with Stannis or striking out on our own, we can't sit idle in Harrenhal forever." They let silence settle again. Then Robb reached out, clasping Jon's arm. "Brother," he said softly, "I know things are complicated now, but I couldn't have done any of this without you. You saved me more times than I can count." Jon felt a lump in his throat. "You saved me in your own way," he said. "Gave me a place here." He swallowed hard, bowing his head. "We'll see this through, together." Robb's smile was faint, shadowed by sorrow. "Together." The days turned into a blur of councils, ravens, training sessions, and the slow healing of Ned Stark's injuries. Word finally arrived from King's Landing that Joffrey was furious at the exchange, blaming Cersei for yielding Jaime so easily. But Tywin held firm. Better to have the Kingslayer back and keep the North at bay for a time. Tyrion Lannister, rumored to be the hand of the king now, maneuvered in the capital to contain Joffrey's worst impulses. All the while, the realm teetered on the brink of greater conflict, with Stannis and Renly each calling banners. At last, Ned deemed himself strong enough to travel, and he summoned the Northern Lords to a final council in Harrenhal's battered Great Hall. Jon stood near the dais with Robb while Ned took a seat. He still tired easily, and there was no point in denying it. The assembly was smaller than the full host, limited to a handful of key commanders and bannermen. Ned spoke first. "We have possible approaches. 1. We remain here in Harrenhal, forcing Tywin to attack us if he wishes to reclaim this fortress. 2. We ride west to challenge him on his own ground, hoping to break his power. Or 3. We go north to regroup, entrenching ourselves behind Moat Cailin, daring them to try breaching the neck. Each path has its perils." Great Jon Umber pounded a fist on the table. "I say we ride west, burn Lannisport if we must, and break Tywin's hold on the Westerlands. Let him know the fear we northern men felt when we learned you were captured." A roar of agreement followed from some. Others looked less certain. Roose Bolton's voice slid into the conversation, quiet and cutting. "A bolder plan, yes, but risky. The west is Tywin's domain. He has allies there, strongholds, mountains behind which he can fortify. It could turn into a war of attrition we can ill afford." Ned's brow furrowed. "I am loath to bring war to the small folk of the Westerlands who have done nothing to us. But I understand the logic. If we strike at Tywin's seat of power, we might force him to the table again. But we must weigh that against the possibilities from the Baratheons. If we ally with Stannis or Renly, we might not need to fight Tywin alone." A ripple of anxious talk spread through the men. Some declared they wanted no southern alliances, others suggested it might be wise if the North aimed to stand truly independent. Robb lifted a hand, quieting them. My father and I have received letters from Stannis, who demands fealty. Renly's messengers have also come, offering marriage pacts. He is rumored to have the backing of the Tyrells. Each wants us to kneel, though in different ways. Ned grimaced. Renly might promise a kinder alliance, but he has no true claim by blood if Stannis is indeed Robert's elder brother. Even so, in war, blood and law can become secondary to strength of arms. Let us not forget how Robert seized the throne in the first place. They argued deep into the night, no easy consensus emerging. The Great Jon and Karstark favored an aggressive westward push. Bolton leaned toward cunning alliances. The Tully lords wanted to secure the Riverlands first, worried that if the Starks marched away, the Lannisters would return in force. By the time the council ended, the men were exhausted, the hall filled with tension. Ned rose heavily from his seat, leaning on the armrest. We must rest and think this through carefully, he declared. War is not a game to be decided on impulse. And so they dispersed. Robb accompanied Ned back to his chamber. Jon lingered behind, exchanging a glance with Bolton, who watched him with that unsettling, calculating gaze. Bolton gave him a thin smile, said nothing, and slipped out. Jon felt the hair on his neck prickle. Whatever side Bolton chose, he would do so for his own advantage. Outside, the night was thick with haze, the sky a moonless black. The men who had argued so fiercely in the hall had retreated to their makeshift quarters, the corridors quiet. Jon, restless, took a torch and wandered Harrenhal's labyrinthine passages until he reached the far courtyard near the main gate. There, he found Theon Greyjoy by the stables, apparently drunk, trying to flirt with a stable hand who looked more amused than flattered. Theon noticed Jon's arrival and scoffed. Look who it is, our good old Black Crow turned wolfish. Come to see me off to bed, Snow? Jon ignored Theon's taunt, glancing around to see if any trouble lurked. Go sleep it off, Theon. We have a war council again tomorrow. Theon rolled his eyes. So serious you are. Always the honorable bastard. He snorted. You know, if you're that anxious, maybe you ought to slip away from here. Return to your crows or something. Jon's temper flared, but he remembered how war wore on every man differently. Theon had been a captive ward in Winterfell for years, and these uncertain times might chafe him in ways Jon could only guess. He forced a steadier voice. We're all on edge, Theon. Go rest. Let's not quarrel. Theon huffed as if disappointed he didn't provoke a fight. Fine. Enjoy your lonely stroll, Snow. With that, he turned to weave unsteadily toward the main keep. Jon sighed, casting a final look around the courtyard. Ghost was nowhere in sight, probably off hunting vermin in the stables. The night air was muggy, oppressive. Jon ascended the steps to the outer ramparts, letting his mind wander to the weight of the secret that always gnawed at him. If the realm discovered that Ned Stark's bastard was actually the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, what might happen? Would they flock to him as a rightful king, or hunt him down like a rabid dog? He wanted neither. He stood on the battlements, torch sputtering in the damp breeze. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he thought he sensed a presence at his back and turned, half expecting some shadow from these haunted walls. Nothing but the gloom. The wind whispered around him. He frowned, uncertain, but soon the feeling passed, replaced by the knowledge that the path ahead was no clearer than the night sky. In the morning, Ned Stark summoned Jon to his room. When Jon arrived, he found Ned sitting by the small table near a window, a half-eaten plate of bread and eggs pushed aside, his face drawn. At the side stood Robb, arms folded, concern etched in his posture. Maester Vyman hovered, collecting finished letters. Close the door, Ned said quietly. Jon obeyed. The thick wooden door thumped shut, leaving them in private. Ned waved a hand to Vyman, who departed with a slight bow, leaving father, son, and the one they had called brother in a hush. Ned gestured to a chair. Sit, Jon. Jon sat, a knot forming in his gut. Robb gave him a slight, encouraging nod. Ned sighed and pressed his fingertips together. I've spoken with Robb about how to proceed in this war. One matter weighs upon us all, the North's future. Another matter weighs upon me, your future, Jon. His gaze was kind but firm. I did not wish to see you pay for breaking your vows. Yet we both know that the Night's Watch might not be so forgiving. Jon swallowed. I know, father, but I cannot see how to fix that. I cannot atone while the war rages. Ned dipped his head. Perhaps after it's done, we can speak to Lord Commander Mormont, see if he will pardon you. But that remains uncertain. Meanwhile, you have proven yourself. The men respect you, and you have saved Robb's life. You're as much a Stark as my other children, save for the name. I would have offered you a place at Winterfell if I could, but the gods know your birth complicates matters in ways none of us can truly ignore. Jon cast his eyes down. I don't want to lay claim to anything that's not mine. My only desire is to serve House Stark. Robb stepped forward. "Father has an idea," he said. "But we wanted your counsel before we act." Jon raised his gaze, confused. Ned exhaled. "I intend to legitimize you as a Stark." The words struck Jon like a hammer blow. He almost lost his breath. "Legitimize me? But you'd be acknowledging me as your trueborn son, which I'm not." Ned's expression was grim but determined. "In the eyes of law and tradition, I can name you a Stark. No king's decree is needed if I present you as a recognized child. Some would question it, certainly, especially with the realm in upheaval. But if Robb is king in the north, it's well within his right to legitimize any child of the Lord of Winterfell, especially with my blessing." A swirl of emotions battered Jon's mind: hope, fear, confusion, loyalty. He thought of how he'd dreamed all his life of shedding the label of bastard, how he had yearned for acceptance. Yet he also felt guilt, for he was no son of Ned's, not by blood. "What of my real father's name?" he asked, the words half-choked. "If you name me a Stark, you bury the truth of Rhaegar Targaryen forever." Ned nodded heavily. "I do, but that truth endangers you more than you know. And you have lived as a Stark. That is the honest truth in your heart. If someday we must reveal the rest, we can. But for now, this measure would protect you from the Night's Watch condemnation, from the scorn of lords who might see you as a foreign threat. You would be Jon Stark, my son, recognized as part of House Stark." Robb's face shone with warmth. "No more black cloak," he said. "No more half-smiles from the men. You'd stand among us. I think it's right, Jon. You fought like a Stark. It's what father wants, and what you deserve." Jon felt tears threatening. He fought to keep his composure. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "I've wanted that my entire life. But it feels wrong too. My mother was Lyanna Stark, but my father was Rhaegar Targaryen. I have Targaryen blood in my veins. Wouldn't it be a lie to call me your trueborn son?" Ned's eyes glistened. "A lie of technicalities, perhaps. But in the ways that truly matter, you are my son. I raised you. I taught you. I love you as fiercely as I do Robb or Bran, or any of my children. This war threatens to tear the realm apart. If acknowledging you as a Stark keeps you safer, I would do it 1,000 times over. Consider it an act of paternal love, if not perfect honesty." Jon's chest felt too tight to draw breath. He glanced at Robb, who nodded, giving him silent support. Then he turned back to Ned. "I accept," Jon breathed. "I accept your offer, but know that I will not forget who I am. If ever the moment comes when the truth must be revealed, I'll not hide from it." Ned's shoulders relaxed, relief shining in his eyes. "Then it's settled. I'll draw up the necessary papers, and Robb, as king in the north, will sign off. We'll proclaim you Jon Stark, recognized son of Eddard Stark." A pause. "You may be asked to swear fealty to the north. Will you do so?" Jon let out a trembling breath. "Yes," he said, heart-hammering. "I swear." Ned stood, wincing at the ache in his side, and placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then rise as my son. May the old gods watch over you." Robb grinned, tears shining. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said softly, "but I'm glad for it." Jon found himself in a tight embrace, first from Robb, then from Ned, as close to father and brother as he'd ever dared dream. For an instant, he let the warmth of that acceptance fill him, easing the old ache of bastardy. He was not blind to the risk of forging a false legitimacy, but it was no more false in his eyes than the facade he had lived all his life. He was of Stark blood through Lyanna. The Targaryen part remained locked away, a secret only 3 of them carried. When at last they parted, Ned sank back into his chair, breathing heavily but smiling. "We will make the announcement soon," he said. "We need only wait until the men gather. Some might question it, but they will follow Robb's lead. And once it is done, you shall ride at his side not as a bastard, but as a Stark." His voice grew hoarse with emotion. "I only wish it had been under happier circumstances." Jon swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed. "I won't fail you." Ned nodded, exhaustion pulling at him. Robb clapped Jon on the shoulder. "We'll let father rest. Come, we must prepare for tonight's feast. It won't be lavish, but the men gather to celebrate father's recovery, and we can slip in the announcement then or the next day." Jon's mind reeled. "All right," he said, letting Robb guide him out. As they left the room, he cast one last glance at Ned, who offered a tired, approving nod. Outside, in the corridor, Robb grinned at him, that same grin Jon recalled from childhood days practicing swords in Winterfell's yard. "It's a strange day," Robb murmured. "The war goes on, but at least we can take a moment to set things right for you." "My brother." Jon felt an overwhelming surge of affection. "My brother," he echoed, and they walked on together, hearts full. That night, a subdued feast took place in Harrenhal's expansive but half-ruined banquet hall. Torches ringed the chamber, illuminating mismatched tables and benches dragged in from across the fortress. Servants circulated with jugs of ale and wine, while a few minstrels from Riverrun tried to lift the mood with soft tunes. The lords of the north and the Riverlands mingled, though the tension of war never truly left their voices. The building reeked of soot and damp stone, the high ceiling vanishing into shadow. Ned Stark sat at the central table with Catelyn by his side, Sansa and Arya to either side of them. Robb took the place of honor at one end, wearing a simple cloak pinned with a direwolf clasp. He had no interest in fancy crowns. Jon stood behind Robb's seat, uncertain of how he should conduct himself in such a gathering. The old custom was for a lord's bastard to stand near the dais if invited, but rarely to sit at the high table. Yet tonight might mark a change. Catelyn's eyes flickered over Jon with that old mixture of wariness and reluctant acceptance. She knew something was afoot. Ned and Robb had not hidden that they planned an announcement, though they had not shared the details. She said nothing, focusing instead on Ned's well-being, ensuring he ate enough. Ned looked weary but determined, quietly conversing with a subdued Sansa while Arya fidgeted with her spoon. Wine flowed and the hall grew more convivial. The Grey Jon roared out a crude joke that earned hearty laughs from nearby men-at-arms. Lord Karstark sipped ale, occasionally glaring at a red and gold tapestry shredded along one wall as though it reminded him of Lannister colors. Even Roose Bolton lifted a goblet, his face unreadable. The air hummed with speculation about the next moves in the war. At length, Robb rose from his seat, raising a hand for silence. The chatter ebbed into anticipation, all eyes turning to the young wolf. Standing tall, Robb looked across the hall, the flickering torchlight dancing on his auburn hair. "My lords, ladies," he began, "we gather to honor the recovery of my father, Lord Eddard Stark, and to reaffirm our unity in these trying times. The war is not done, but we have achieved much. We have secured the Riverlands. We have forced the Lannisters to bargain. We have reunited the Stark family. For that, we should be grateful." A low murmur of approval rolled through the crowd. Robb waited until it subsided. "Yet there is one more matter that must be addressed. Many of you know Jon Snow, who has fought at my side in the Whispering Wood, who saved my life in battle more than once. He is known to you as my father's bastard son." Robb paused, letting the statement settle. The word bastard drew some glances, some shrugs. Jon tensed, heart thrumming. Ned's gaze moved to Jon, a faint smile of encouragement. Catelyn's face tightened, uncertain. Arya's eyes lit with curiosity, while Sansa looked anxious. Robb went on, voice clear. "I tell you now that my father has decided, with my approval as king in the north, to recognize Jon as his son in full. Let it be known that from this day forward, Jon Snow shall be Jon Stark, no longer a bastard, but a true son of Winterfell." Silence fell. Dozens of lords, knights, and men-at-arms exchanged stunned looks. Some seemed pleased, recalling Jon's valor on the battlefield. Others appeared confused, uncertain what difference it made. But in the hush, the decision's weight was palpable. A wave of disbelief passed across the hall, then a flicker of approval from some corners. The great Jon let out a loud whoop of delight, hoisting his ale. Karstark studied Jon with a thoughtful nod. Bolton's face remained coldly impassive. Across the hall, Theon Greyjoy smirked, raising a brow in surprise. Ned rose slowly, leaning on the table for support. "I, Eddard Stark, affirm this," he said, voice resonating in the hush. "He is my blood and kin. You shall treat him henceforth as you would any true-born son of Winterfell." Murmurs ran through the gathering, bursts of applause here and there. Robb gestured to Jon. "Come, brother," he said warmly. "Take your rightful place." Jon's palms were slick with sweat as he stepped around the table. He felt a dozen eyes on him, men who had known him as the quiet bastard or seen him in the thick of battle. He also caught Catelyn's gaze, uncertain and guarded, but she did not protest. He sank to one knee before Ned and Robb. The swirling torches made the shadows dance across their faces. Ned cleared his throat. "Jon, I name you a Stark. Will you swear fealty to your king, Robb Stark, and to Winterfell to stand as a loyal son of the North?" Jon raised his head, tears threatening behind his eyes. "I will," he said, voice trembling. "I swear it." Ned inclined his head, motioning for him to rise. Robb clasped Jon's forearm and pulled him to his feet, a grin splitting Robb's face. Applause rippled across the hall, uncertain but growing stronger. A few cups banged on tables, the great Jon leading a chant of Stark. Stark! Stark! Until it rumbled like distant thunder in the vastness of the hall. Jon stood there, stunned by the wave of acceptance. For the first time, he was not a bastard on the fringes but recognized in the eyes of men as a Stark. He turned, half-dazed, to see Arya's fierce grin, Sansa's polite but still guarded smile, and finally Catelyn's reserved nod. The Lady of Winterfell, though clearly uneasy, offered the briefest courtesy. It was more than Jon had ever expected. Ned gently settled back into his seat, exhaustion painted on his face. Robb put a hand on Jon's shoulder, leading him to sit near the dais. Servants hurried forward, setting an extra chair next to Robb's at the high table. Jon lowered himself into it, conscious of how many stares still flick at his way, but also conscious of the sense of belonging that finally surrounded him like a cloak. The feast resumed, talk buzzing with the news. Toasts were offered to the new Jon Stark, though some men whispered that it was an unusual move. Bastard or no, a recognized Stark was no small matter in the north. The ale flowed and tension began to fade into a sense of camaraderie. War might loom, but for one night they let themselves celebrate a bright spot in the gloom. Jon answered well-wishers with quiet humility. The great Jon thumped him on the back so hard that Jon almost fell over, roaring, "A worthy lad, didn't I say so?" Karstark gave him a curt nod. One of the Mormont women patted Jon's arm, acknowledging his place. Even Theon raised a cup in Jon's direction before turning away, though with a half-smirk. Roose Bolton alone offered only a thin-lipped smile, eyes glinting with some unreadable thought. As the night stretched on, Ned and Catelyn retired first, accompanied by Sansa and Arya. Ned was still recovering, and the day's event had drained him. He embraced Jon briefly as he left, whispering, "Be proud, my son." The words nearly undid Jon. Robb remained, holding informal court at the table, letting the men approach with concerns about provisioning, about patrols, about Tywin's next move. Jon watched and listened, occasionally offering an insight from his vantage on the battlefield. Each time he spoke, men gave him more respect than before, calling him Lord Jon or My Lord Stark. It felt unreal, as though he inhabited another man's life. At length, the hall began to thin out, men stumbling away, bellies full of ale, voices slurred with weariness. Robb rubbed his temples. "I'm off to bed as well," he said softly. "You should rest, too. Tomorrow we continue planning." Jon nodded, standing. "Good night, Robb." "Good night, brother," Robb returned with a tired grin. The word brother carried new depth, untainted by the sting of bastardy. Jon made his way across the hall, stepping over discarded cups and half-finished trenchers. Ghost slipped out from under a table, padding by his side. The dire wolf had been gleaning scraps, but now followed faithfully. The corridor was quieter than usual. The torches burnt low. Jon's new station in life weighed on him with every step. He was Jon Stark now, or so the realm would see him. A piece of him, the piece that knew the truth of his birth, whispered that he wore a borrowed name. But he suppressed that thought. If Ned believed in him, that was enough. He climbed a spiral staircase, seeking the small chamber assigned to him. The keep stones radiated the day's heat, though the nights were cooling with the approach of autumn. At last, he reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The room was plain, a single bed, a chest for clothes, and a table with a stub of candle. Ghost trotted in, settling in a corner. Jon shut the door and leaned against it, a rush of conflicting emotions catching up with him all at once. He was a Stark. He was Rhaegar Targaryen's son. He was a deserter from the Night's Watch. He was a brother to Robb, beloved by Ned. He was a soldier in a war that seemed to have no end. All these identities swirled in his mind, leaving him breathless. Eventually, he pushed off the door and moved to the small window slit, looking down into the courtyard below. The moon had risen, silver light casting Harrenhal's melted towers into sharp relief. Somewhere out there, Tywin Lannister plotted. In King's Landing, Joffrey sat on the throne, a child king with cruelty at his beck. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen, His aunt, though he scarcely remembered that dimension of the story, might be rising to claim her own birthright. The world spun with secrets and ambitions. Yet in that moment, Jon felt something like contentment. He had a name, a place, a father who loved him. War would come, and battles too, but he was not alone. He was a Stark. Let the realm shift as it would. He would stand with the wolves come what may. A week passed, full of quiet tension and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Letters flew from Harrenhal to every corner of the 7 kingdoms, some from Ned, some from Robb. Messengers came and went, bringing rumors of Renly's grand progress south, of Stannis massing ships at Dragonstone, of Tywin rallying the west. The northern lords drilled their men, restocked supplies. Harrenhal's forges burned day and night. The fortress, for all its curses, became a base of operations, a spider's web of strategy at the heart of a realm unraveling into multiple claimants for the Iron Throne. Jon found himself busier than ever. Robb tapped him to oversee certain watch rotations, to assess new recruits from the Riverlands who'd volunteered to join the Stark host. Most accepted Jon's new status without complaint, though older knights occasionally raised eyebrows at the new young lord. Still, Robb's unwavering endorsement kept them in line. Catelyn rarely spoke to Jon beyond polite courtesies, but she did not interfere in his duties. Sansa seemed torn between curiosity and caution. Arya, on the other hand, was delighted, occasionally teasing him that he should give her sword lessons now that he was a true-born Stark. Meanwhile, Ned continued to recover, though slowly. The scars of imprisonment and near execution were not just physical. Late at night, Jon sometimes passed Ned's door and heard the older man pacing, as though haunted by memories. Yet each day, Ned dressed and met with lords, planning. His presence lent the Northern Alliance a calm sense of legitimacy. Men trusted Ned Stark more than they trusted their own cunning. One afternoon, Ned summoned Jon to a small courtyard behind the castle's main keep. The place was ringed by high walls, remnants of old fortress expansions. A pair of battered archery targets leaned against stone blocks, and a scattering of wooden training swords lay on a bench. Jon approached to see Ned standing by a brazier, warming his hands against the chill. The sun was hidden by thick clouds, promising rain. "You wanted me, father?" Jon asked, mindful that no one else was in earshot. Ned turned, a slight smile curving his lips. "Yes. I needed a moment away from the war councils. And I wanted to see you." He gestured to the training swords. "Remember how we used to spar in Winterfell's yard?" Jon's heart tightened with nostalgia. "Yes, very well. You or Ser Roderick would watch me and Robb and the others. Sometimes you'd correct our footwork." Ned nodded. "You were always quick to learn. Do you have time for a quick bout?" He sighed, pressing a hand to his stiff shoulder. "I cannot fight as I once did, but I can still show you a trick or two." Jon's chest filled with warmth. "Of course." They each took a wooden sword from the bench, testing the weight. The handle felt rough compared to Longclaw's well-crafted hilt, but that hardly mattered. Jon took a stance opposite Ned, mindful that his father was not fully recovered. Ned mirrored him, feet planted. They began slowly, testing each other's reflexes with light taps. Jon watched Ned's face for signs of pain, not wanting to push him too hard. Ned's expression grew more animated as they went on. He pressed a quick feint, which Jon parried. Then Ned gave a satisfied grunt, stepping back. "You keep your guard high," Ned said. "But watch your right side, it drifts. Someone faster could slip a blade there." Jon adjusted, feeling the old rhythms flow back. Their wooden swords clacked in the quiet courtyard, echoing off the walls. Gray clouds overhead deepened, a promise of rain. Occasionally, a guard passed on the walkway above, glancing down, but none interrupted. Jon found himself smiling. It felt like old times, except now he was older, stronger, and recognized as a Stark. After a few more exchanges, Ned lowered his sword, breathing heavily. "That's enough," he murmured. "My side aches. I'm not the man I once was." Jon moved in, gently offering an arm. "You did well," he said. "It's good to see you like this." Ned sank down on the bench, resting the wooden sword at his side. "I feel alive when I fight, but the body betrays me." He shook his head, then patted the bench for Jon to join him. "Sit. We'll talk a moment." Jon settled beside him, wooden sword across his lap. The drizzle began, soft at first, pattering on the stone floor. Ned tilted his head, letting the mist settle on his hair. "I used to dream of seeing you as a true-born Stark," he said quietly. "Running Winterfell with Robb or forging your own path. But life had other plans." Jon gazed at the raindrops. You protected me, gave me a home. I owe you everything." Ned's eyes brimmed with paternal pride. "I only wish your mother could have seen you grown. Lina, she loved fiercely. I remember the day she left with Rhaegar. I was furious at him, at her, at the world. But I also remember how she looked at him, with a kind of yearning that went deeper than sense. She believed he was a good man, not the monster Robert's rebels painted. If he had lived, perhaps you wouldn't have needed hiding." A half-sad laugh escaped him. "Perhaps a great many things would be different." Jon listened, heart aching for the mother he never knew. For a father he barely remembered was Targaryen. "I hope I do her proud," he managed. "You do," Ned said, voice trembling. "In ways you cannot imagine." They sat in silence as the drizzle thickened, turning into a gentle shower. Jon's hair grew damp, Ned's cloak darkening with water. Ghost, who had been skulking somewhere, suddenly appeared at the courtyard's edge, glaring at the sky as though offended by the rain. Ned noticed and let out a soft chuckle. At length, Ned shifted, returning to the grim realities. "We may ride west soon," he said. "The great Jon pushes for it, and I begin to see the merit. We force Tywin to defend his own lands. With luck, we'll draw his armies away from the Riverlands. Then maybe we can strike an accord with one of the Baratheon brothers, hopefully Stannis. But it'll be dangerous." Jon squared his shoulders. "Then I'll ride with you or with Robb wherever I'm needed." Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Thank you, my son." With that, he rose slightly shakily, and together they walked from the courtyard, braving the increasing rain. The clash of wooden swords had ceased, replaced by the quiet drum of raindrops on stone. The decision to march west came 2 days later, a compromise forged between Ned, Robb, and their bannermen. They would not aim to burn Lannisport or terrorize small folk, but they would move into the Westerlands, seeking to draw Tywin out. Meanwhile, ravens to Stannis continued, urging alliance. If Stannis recognized northern independence, or at least autonomy, and demanded only that they aid him in toppling the Lannisters, Ned might accept. But such negotiations would take time. For now, the sword would decide. Preparations began in earnest. The northern host, numbering several thousand, prepared to leave Harrenhal. A smaller garrison would remain, under Roose Bolton's nominal command, to hold the fortress against any Lannister incursion. Riverrun, too, would see a portion of the army remain, ensuring the Tully seats stayed protected. Ned, despite lingering injuries, insisted on traveling with the main force. Catelyn would remain in Harrenhal with Sansa and Arya, safer there than on campaign in the west. The morning of departure dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with looming clouds. War horns echoed off the misshapen towers as the men assembled in the outer yard. Banners snapped in a brisk wind. The direwolf of Stark, the sunburst of Karstark, the flayed man of Bolton, the roaring bear of Mormont. Horses pawed the muddy ground, knights adjusting armor, infantry forming ranks. Jon, newly minted Jon Stark, oversaw a portion of the cavalry muster, checking bridles and saddles. Ghost prowled near his feet. At times, Jon had to remind himself he was no longer an outsider. The men called him "my lord" now. He tried to meet them with calm competence, though inside he still felt the swirl of old anxieties. He spotted Theon Greyjoy among the archers, flirting with a black-haired woman who was helping pass out quivers. Theon seemed oddly unsettled these last days, though Jon knew not why. Perhaps the tension of war or news from the Iron Islands. Jon let it pass. They had no time for petty quarrels. Eventually, Ned appeared, flanked by Robb and the Grey Jon. Ned wore plain armor, his cloak pinned by the direwolf sigil. He still moved with caution, favoring his left side, but determination radiated from him. At his approach, the men quieted. Ned stood at the front, surveying them. "Men of the North," he called, voice-carrying. "Men of the Trident. We march west to confront the Lannisters, who would trample our rights and threaten our lands. We do not ride for loot or pillage, we ride for justice. Honor the codes of war. Harm no small folk if they yield. But if Tywin's men stand against us, show them the steel of the wolf." A resounding cheer rose from the assembly, blades rattling on shields. Robb lifted his sword, no king's crown, but the men revered him all the same. Then horns blared once more. The gates of Harrenhal opened with a groan, and the host began to file out in a long column, horses and wagons following foot soldiers along the broad, churned road. Jon positioned himself near Robb as commanded. Grey Wind trotted at Robb's side, Ghost at Jon's. Ahead, Ned rode with the Grey Jon, dictating the pace. Rain threatened again, the sky lowering in swirling gloom. Harrenhal's black towers receded behind them, looming like a specter over the marshy landscape. Roose Bolton stood on the battlements, watching them depart with that cool, unreadable expression. Jon felt a twist of nerves as the column moved. War awaited them in the Westerlands, likely a confrontation with Tywin. Death would come, but he had chosen this path, a Stark among Starks. He urged his horse onward, matching Robb's stride, forging into the unknown. Let the realm see them, father and sons, brothers in arms, carrying the direwolf banner on the march to meet the lion's roar. They advanced through the Riverlands without incident, greeted by small folk who offered wary nods. Many had suffered under the Lannisters' raids. They welcomed Ned Stark's presence, for his reputation for fair dealing extended far. Supplies were gathered from allies, wagons loaded with grain and salted meats. Jon coordinated the dispatch of foraging parties, mindful of Ned's order not to terrorize villages. As they neared the border of the Westerlands, the terrain changed: rocky hills, dense copses of pine. Scouts reported Lannister outposts perched on vantage points. Tywin's men were aware of the northern approach, but they had not yet massed in full. Robb and Ned debated strategies each night, sometimes intense sessions with the Great Jon or Karstark or other lords, but always reaching a united front. They would push deeper, hoping to bait Tywin into open battle. The first skirmish came near the Tumblestone, where a Lannister scouting party clashed with the Karstark outriders. Jon arrived with a cavalry detachment in time to see a half-dozen Lannister men racing away. One Karstark rider lay dead, an arrow in his neck. Jon knelt by the body, wincing at the sight of how swiftly war claimed its due. He felt the old anger simmer, but also a sense of grim acceptance. This was the price of the path they'd chosen. They pressed on, encountering little villages with shuttered windows, the inhabitants terrified of an invading army. Ned posted guards to ensure no looting. On the third day, they came upon a small Lannister garrison holding a rickety fort along a ridge. The Great Jon led an assault at dawn, and the fort fell quickly, the Lannister soldiers surrendering. Another victory for the wolves, if minor. Morale rose among the troops, though Ned cautioned them not to grow complacent. Jon fought in that brief engagement, clashing swords with a Lannister man who wore half a lion's crest on his tunic. The man's blade slid against Jon's armor, nearly piercing his side, but Jon managed a counterstrike that cut him down. It was a sobering reminder of how close death hovered. He remembered nights in Winterfell's courtyard, longing to be a knight to prove himself. Now he realized knighthood was only a veneer over the horror of real battle. At night, Jon found himself lying awake in his tent, ghost curled at his feet. Rain pattered on the canvas. He thought of the true father he never met, Rhaegar Targaryen, a man who had died in battle on the Trident. Would Jon meet a similar fate on some muddy field, fighting a war that might never end? Yet he would not abandon the Starks. He was Jon Stark now, and that meant standing beside them, come what may. Days bled into weeks. The northern host pressed deeper into the Westerlands, capturing minor Lannister outposts, scattering small forces. They advanced methodically, each new foothold bringing them closer to Tywin's seat of power. The tension mounted with every league. Tywin was out there, gathering strength, waiting for the moment to strike. Late one afternoon, a rider came galloping in from the west, dust coating his cloak. He demanded to see Ned and Robb. Jon was present as the man. One of their outriders reported a large Lannister army assembling near the Golden Tooth, a fortress in the hills that guarded the approach to Lannisport. They have at least 10,000 men, M-Lord, the scout said breathlessly, bowing to Ned. More arrive by the day. Knights, foot, siege engines. Looks like Tywin is preparing for a full engagement. A hush fell over the command tent. Robb glanced at Ned, concern etched on his face. Ned pressed his lips together. We have near 8,000. Perhaps a few more if the Tully levies arrive in time. If we face them head-on at the Golden Tooth, we'll be outmatched. Karstark muttered a curse. The Great Jon bristled. We can take them on the field. The Lannisters are soft. Ned shook his head. Tywin is no fool. If he outnumbers us and holds the high ground near the Golden Tooth, it would be a slaughter. We must think differently. Maybe we lure them out, or strike from multiple angles. Bolton spoke in that calm, unsettling tone, suggesting a flanking maneuver that might trap the Lannisters in a valley. Others debated a night attack. The tension escalated until Robb raised a hand, quieting them. We must be swift but cautious, he said. We can't allow ourselves to be pinned down. Ned nodded. Agreed. We'll set camp to the east near the Red Lion Hills. Then send out our scouts in force. Let us see how Tywin positions his lines. We might find a weakness or force him to divide. Thus decided, the camp bustled with orders. Jon rode out to help coordinate the scouts. Rain threatened again, turning the roads to muck. A heavy sense of anticipation gripped them all. A major battle seemed inevitable. As dusk fell, Jon returned to the newly chosen campsite on a ridge overlooking a shallow ravine. Tents dotted the slope, fires flickering. Soldiers trudged through the mud, complaining about damp bedrolls and the smell of wet horses. In the center, Ned and Robb's pavilions rose, guarded by a ring of Stark men. Lightning flickered on the horizon, a jagged glimpse of nature's fury. Jon stabled his horse, patting the mare's flank wearily. Ghost loped at his side, equally exhausted from the day's ride. He made his way toward Ned's tent, hoping to deliver a brief report on the route scouted. But as he approached, he spotted movement behind Ned's tent. Someone slipping around to back, a hooded figure in the gloom. Jon tensed. The air smelled of damp wool and fear. "Who goes?" Jon demanded, stepping forward, hand on Longclaw's hilt. The hooded figure paused, half lit by a flicker from a nearby torch, then turned as if to flee. Ghost snarled, bounding forward. Jon dashed after them. A brief chase ensued around the rear of the pavilion, through crates of supplies and tethered horses. The figure stumbled, cursing, and Jon seized them by the cloak, yanking them back. The cloak fell away to reveal a wiry man with beady eyes and a thin mustache, a dagger clutched in one hand. He slashed wildly at Jon, but Ghost sprang in, teeth bared, forcing the man to drop his blade or lose his arm. Jon twisted the man's wrist, hurling him to the muddy ground. "Yield!" Jon snarled, adrenaline pounding. The man hissed but stilled, pinned by Jon's knee. A pair of Stark guards came running at the sound. They seized the man's arms, hauling him upright. "What's this about?" one demanded. "Who is he?" Jon grabbed the man's chin, forcing him to look up. "He was lurking near Lord Stark's tent," Jon said. "I suspect a cut purse or worse." The man spat muddy water, glaring with desperation. "I'm just a poor cell's word. I got lost." Ghost growled, muzzle inches from the man's face. Jon's pulse hammered with suspicion. He saw no sigil on the man's tunic, but a faint shape near the collar suggested a removed badge. Possibly Lannister? The guards yanked the man to his feet. "We'll take him to Lord Stark," they growled. "He'll decide what to do." Jon nodded, following them toward Ned's tent. Ned had heard the commotion and emerged, cloak over his shoulders, Robb at his side. Both looked alarmed. The guards shoved the captive forward, and Ned's gaze hardened. "Who is he?" Ned demanded. "A spy, likely," Jon answered. "Caught him sneaking around." The man trembled, eyes darting from Jon to Ned. "Mercy, my lord. I'm no spy, I swear. I was just looking for food, some coins to steal maybe. Times are hard." Ned studied the man intently. "Check him for weapons or tokens," he told the guards. They searched him roughly, turning out pockets. A small lion pin, tarnished but unmistakably shaped like the Lannister sigil, rolled out onto the wet ground. The man's face went ashen. Robb picked it up, scowling. "A Lannister badge." He looked at the man coldly. "You lie poorly." Ned exhaled, sorrow mingling with anger. "We have ways of dealing with spies." He turned to the guards. "Take him. Bind him. I want him questioned gently, if possible, but we need answers." The prisoner squirmed. "The Lannisters will reward you if you release me," he spat, desperation crossing his face. "Gold. Power. Don't do this. I can help you." Ned's jaw tensed. "We are not traitors," he said. "Nor do we trade in bribes. Remove him from my sight." The guards dragged the man off, leaving Ned, Robb, and Jon in the flickering torchlight. Rain dripped off the pavilion's edges, painting everything in dark, shining strokes. Ned stared after them, shoulders heavy. "So Tywin sends spies to our camp. This is but one of many, no doubt." Robb nodded grimly. "We must increase our patrols around the perimeter." Ned agreed, rubbing his brow. "Yes. If Tywin knows we're near, we lose the element of surprise. Tomorrow we'll gather the lords. Perhaps we should feint or try another route. This could be our greatest challenge yet." They stood there in the rainy night, tension thick. Jon felt the chills seeping into his bones. War was upon them in earnest. The next battle could decide the fate of the North and of House Stark. As the thunder rumbled across the sky, he steeled himself for what was to come. The day he longed for once, where he could prove himself in battle, had arrived, and it offered only blood and fear. Yet he would face it with sword in hand, a Stark among Starks. A storm was coming, and the wolves would howl.